Okay, so today I actually have two different slide decks that I've actually uploaded them on Canvas because some of you said it would be nice if you had them before class instead of just after. I finished them just before class, but I uploaded them as soon as I could before then. So I don't know if I'll get through these all today. Maybe, maybe not. There's only like 180 of them, so we'll see. But some of them go pretty quick. This is my view about writing, and as hopefully right, you might believe, right, I've got a little experience at this, but I will also tell you there are many, many other styles that are effective for other people. But I can't teach you a style that I don't really know how to make work. Right? I have colleagues that write very differently from this, and they are also successful. But I don't know how to do those styles. So don't take what I'm going to talk about today as the only way to be successful. It's a way to be successful. I can tell you that it's a pretty good way of being successful. So if you don't have any other reason, it's easy to make lots of mistakes. So even if you don't follow everything I say, in fact, I don't follow everything I say today. Different papers have different audiences, different objectives, different processes. But I want to get a whole bunch of different things about how to tell pretty good stories in. One of the things that I wanted to mention with respect to that is my lab actually has a pretty good record, not just at publishing, but also at winning best paper awards. So we've won, I think, 7 base paper awards in the last 3 years at different conferences. So something about this works for helping my students go out to write. Now, it's not just me, right? A lot of it's also them. They have to be able to tell the story. I can tell you about telling stories, but you have to have the creativity to come up with it and to actually tie that to what works in a paper. So when I sent that survey paper out, it wasn't quite the way I told you to write survey papers, in part because they only gave me 6 pages plus references, so I couldn't really tell as much as I wanted to in the space I wanted because they counted the references against me, so there were like 2 pages of references and whatever. But I knew for what they wanted, right, the review process, which was part of what Steve was just asking me, the review process for this paper is not the normal review process for a survey paper. This was a paper for a conference that has what they called a senior track, and I submitted a 1-page description of my talk, which actually said the talk will be very different from the paper. The paper has got formulas and references, and it's there as a reference. The talk will be examples and stories, which is the way I would really want to write the paper, but I couldn't do that all in the space I wanted. And I know that they will look at my resume, because that was actually, the order was 1-page description, a CV, and a 6-page paper. Now, what do you think what order are they reading stuff in? Well, they're going to look at the 1 page in your CV, and then, yeah, the paper's okay. Right? So not quite the same storytelling I would want you to get to. So don't quite take that as an example. But even in that, I still try to get many of the elements I talk about in this talk today about storytelling are in that paper, just not as well developed as they would be because it was so short. Sometimes students like to have a reference, a book to look at. Some of you are old enough you like books, others would rather just have YouTube videos. So I give both. Actually, it's a Vimeo from Joshua. And this is probably one of the best books on writing for science I know of, which is Writing Science, How to Write Papers That Get Cited and Proposals That Get Funded. This is actually a very well-written book about writing science. Okay, not writing in general. Writing science is a little bit different. Today's talk will actually be a mix of general writing plus writing for science, and you'll see me go back and forth between them. Okay, so the first part about writing is it's a process. And you have to think about both how to get started, but how to have a good process. Especially if you're going to write lots of papers, viewing it as like you code, you have a process for coding. You have the tools for doing it. You have a regular process of going through this. You don't expect the first run of your code to be right. How many of you write perfect code and never have to debug anything? Right? Well, the same. The same is generally true for your papers, right? So you're going to want to have a process that's going to help you start designing towards good code, designing towards good papers, writing good code. We're going to write a paper, debugging and editing, and testing, editing. So it's really a very similar process for the code development, with maybe a much heavier emphasis on the editing, not the writing, as opposed to code. Right? You actually get taught to try and make sure your code doesn't require lots of edits. I will tell you when you get to the story, you're going to do it. So we're going to start with a guy named Jeffrey Gitomer who's got. There's a way to fix this. I'm going to go try and fix it because I have lots of slides that push the margins today. Give me a second. course, I can't see, and I'm just going to understand by a bit. Okay. That's better. Okay. Jeffrey Gitomer, who's a well-known salesperson, but he's also written, I don't know, half a dozen books. This is from his little green book, The 5.5 Things to Improve Your Writing. Okay, the first is just sit down and write. Or if you don't like that one, just sit down and talk, but sit down and get stuff done. Capture your thoughts and your ideas the second they occur. So another thing about writing is you want to strike when you actually have the idea. So the paper I was working on that I just turned in, I literally woke up at 4 o'clock on Thursday morning and had an idea about what that paper should be about. Right? I'd struggled with it. I wasn't even sure I was going to do it. But when I woke up at 4 in the morning and here is what the story is, I got up then and started writing, right? Before it disappeared and vanished, right? If you've ever had ideas come to you in the middle of the night, they almost never survive to morning. If you go back to sleep, they're gone, right? So you just got to strike while the iron's hot when you get some of those ideas. I like to actually, especially in the first draft, but even in a broader sense, I like to write it like you would say it, okay? So it's very plain and direct when you're speaking with people. Lots of people think science writing should be this aloof, third person, whatever, and there are people who will teach you that that's the way you write science. I'm not among them, and data on reading suggests that's generally not the case as the best way of doing it. So there's still a certain reason to be impartial when you're writing, but that doesn't mean I have to do it in third person, never using pronouns and stuff. Then you're going to go through after you're writing, you're going to edit to make sure your thoughts are simple and easy to understand and complete, and probably run it through a spelling checker so you can actually spell and correctly, because now I notice it just says add. Edit early and often, and then 5.5, you're writing for the reader and for yourself, but there's a balance between that. People will often tell you you're writing for the reader, but if you're writing for science, you're also writing for yourself. As you figure out how to write, you figure out your science better, right? And so there's a reason to do that for yourself. Anyone notice anything odd about this list? 5.5? Why do you think it's 5.5? If this list just had 6 items, do you think you'd ever remember it? Maybe not, but 5.5 is like, if this is the first time you've seen a list with a half in it, you're more likely to remember it, which is another little thing about writing, which is you are writing not just to have your readers read your paper, but to remember, cite, be impacted by your paper. And so there's some times where you can put some things together. So what is a good writing process? So if you're doing this the way it should be done, I would say you spend about 25% of your time pre-writing. That is stuff you do before you actually start writing. 25% of your time writing, and 50% of your time rewriting. That is, you spend more time editing and rewriting than you do actually writing. The survey paper that I mentioned, I was done 3/4 of the survey paper by midday Thursday. I started at 4 a.m. By 1 o'clock, I had written the majority of the paper. Now, the citations weren't proper. There was a ton of stuff to do to rewrite the paper and edit it and whatever. And I spent Thursday afternoon and most of the day Friday rewriting the paper and editing it. Right? But I had the core of the paper down. In fact, it was too long. It was 8 pages. I had to get it down to shorter versions to get it to fit in everything else. So you want to have a good process and timelines and tools. So that paper was done in Git. If you want to explore like my Git commit history, you'll see the first commit was like first 4 sections was like one giant commit because I just got up and started banging away and said, okay, now it's time for lunch. I'll commit this and go off. Doing track changes, whatever you want to do, but that's really part of a good process. And to commit, make edits, commit, make some notes about what's going on. Now, in this case, the pre-writing was a little bit different because this paper was something I was going to submit 2.5 weeks ago. So I'd already thought a lot about it. And then it was like, oh, look, the deadline is like 2 weeks into September. I'm not going to work on this at all. Right? We finished up the actual conference papers we were working on, and I forgot all about it until Tuesday when my sponsor sent me mail saying, I see you started something. You know the deadline's Friday. Are you going to actually turn one in? It's like, okay, I guess I ought to do this. But the most deadly mistake you can make is waiting until it's actually ready. In whatever your sense of ready is, if you start writing when it's ready, you are too late. You should have started earlier. because when you think it's ready, you've now overthought it. You actually want to get it down on paper. You don't want it for it to be perfect. You want it to be really rough so then you can go through it and edit it and edit it and edit it. Rewriting is where the game is won or lost. Rewriting is the essence of writing. You don't actually have to be a great writer. If you can read and say something's wrong with this, you can try lots of perturbations until you get it right. You don't have to say the idea was great the first time. So as I said, I thought about this paper before. The version I came up Thursday morning is not where I was going to be writing 2 weeks ago. In fact, I only came up with it because on Monday's lecture, when I was talking about how to structure stuff and do a survey, I decided, somehow that soaked in, and by Thursday morning, it gave me an idea to actually talk about our work compared to these other things, but structure it in terms of the AI's early history, and I'll come back to some of that story stuff when we get to it. And this is a very long slide, and that's intentional, right? This is a slide that should be rewritten, right? This is a slide that's got lots of good ideas in it, but is so badly oriented that even though you read it, you'll get the ideas out of it, but you don't want to read it. It's like a giant wall of text. It's verbose, it's clunky, it's pretentious, it's boring, right? That's trying to get a point. That's the point. That's the way your writing might start. And then you want to clean it down to some really simple, clean stuff. And you can reduce this to rewriting is where the game is won or lost. Rewriting is the essence of writing, right? Something like that, right? You don't want all of this stuff. But it's tough, right? You start, you get all these ideas down. Once you have them down, it's much easier to throw away ideas than to add them in the middle of a flow, right? So when you're flowing, you just let stuff come out. So we talk about what are called some first drafts. And it's also a different process. So how many of you learn about when you go to write a paper to write an outline? Okay, I would like to recommend you completely throw that all away. Right? So you are going to do something, but I don't recommend you start with an outline because you spend too long trying to organize. Here is the way it's going to flow. You're going to actually want to organize stuff, but with modern technology, and outlines might have been really important when you have to use a manual typewriter, which is how I started, right? Typing papers where it's like, fix it, oh, you have to get white out, go back. You didn't want to do this. But with electronics, if you write a bunch of good paragraphs that you see in the story, you can rearrange them in seconds to tell the story in a better way. So the order that you get out of an outline, it doesn't matter anymore, right? If you have the things to say and you put them together, you can actually play with them and say, yeah, this doesn't work. Oh, that works better. Make this one shorter, make that one longer, right? The outline, the highest level of an outline is what's the story you want to tell. Now that is really important. But I'm going to suggest you actually do that by writing the story in a very short form. And then you expand on the story, and you expand on the story, as opposed to viewing it as a structured outline of stuff. So in your first draft, you want to get lots of stuff down on paper. Then you can rewrite it to make an outline if you want. But if you want to do an outline, do it after you've written most of the paper. And that might just help you in short block form figure out how to organize this. So there's this nice little paper. I don't know if it's still there. I forgot to check today if that link is still valid. But it's all about these bad first drafts. So I would like you to all now, most of you have a computer or paper, so that's good. We're going to do 3 in-class exercises today, so we're going to do the first one. So I don't want you to let the words get in the way. Now this is tough for most people. Many people, when they're writing, look at their writing. Right? You're looking at the words and whatever. How many of you have ever noticed, oh, I misspelled that word, or whatever, right? Many of you, some of us are, we never see that, but and I think that's actually been to my advantage because I don't get bogged down with such little things. So this is an exercise. It's not actually my exercise. I borrowed it, but it's actually, I found it pretty effective for helping students get started. So I want you to, and I'll tell you when to stop, but I want you to just start putting ideas, sentences, phrases about your research. Don't try and connect them all to one big story. Just put down a sentence or 2 or 3 about an idea and then jump to the next idea, whatever free associates, okay? So think of this as sort of your research topic free association minute or 2. And I want you to do this with your eyes closed. And I know people are like, I can't write with my eyes. So it may be watering all over the page, but you will actually find you can scribble enough that later on you can figure it out. Now, it's a little bit weird, and we'll come back to that in a second, but with your eyes closed, write or type if you can type. And again, so typing, you can start to make sure your fingers are on the right part of the keyboard. And if you really want, you can actually, you can do it like this with a piece of paper in front of your laptop, so you can't see what you're typing, but you can see the keyboard if that's necessary for you to do this in between. But I don't want you looking at what you're writing, because it is a natural instinct to reread and get stuck on what you're writing. So just close your eyes and start writing some research ideas. Close your eyes and write. Or if I didn't mention it, this should be in whatever language you think in. No translation during this process. What are you doing? To hide your writing? Okay. You can't do it with your eyes closed? Okay. So anyway, I think that's long enough. So who feels they wrote something that is actually interesting now that you wrote it? Look back and read it first. It's slanted, it's okay. This isn't about penmanship. This is about, did anyone actually feel they had a research idea that when they described it came out well, not in terms of how it's said, but this is something that I really wanted to put down on paper that you had not yet put down on paper. No? No one. Okay. Right. So I mean, so part of this is, if you start doing free association, your brain is wired in certain ways. And if words are in front of the page, for most people, you are reading those words. You're hearing those words in your head. That's limiting your ability to think about other things. Part of what happens from a creativity point of view in the creativity research is the ability to connect things that are somewhat disparate. Okay, if you have too many stimuli, so I'm listening to something, right? And so you can overload your senses and then connections start happening, or you can deprive your senses and then connections start happening. But when you're sort of this middle ground of you're looking at stuff, that's grabbing so much of your attention, it's hard for the next idea to happen, okay? So this exercise was really trying to get you to free yourself. Now, the other way to free yourself, which is again shown in the research literature on creativity, is to actually have like 8 things going on, at which point everything is vying for your attention, right? So the idea of having this quiet time to write is a very weird thing. It works for some people, but for lots of people, the quiet time to write is about getting words on the page. But it may actually limit, for many people, their creativity. Now, for people who have the naturally creative spark where they're thinking of 6 things at once, writing doesn't slow them down, right? Because they're actually connecting all this stuff, and the writing is the slowest part for them. They already have all these connections going on. And those might be the naturally gifted writers or whatever. But for most people, you can't hear 2 sentences in your head, right? You can 2 different topics. They're vying for your attention. But if you type and write with words in your head, and those words are in front of your eyes, it dominates you. So this can be a very useful trick. Now, this was much more interesting when I first did this exercise in like 1980-something. I was an undergrad. But there's a better way of doing this now for almost everybody, which is don't write, talk. You can do the same exercise with your eyes closed in a voice recorder. And actually, if you get a decent dictation tool, they'll get more words correct than your blind typing probably did, although they get some interesting ones wrong. But that can actually help you do your first draft. So I did wait until 7:30 to start speaking my paper as I was doing this, because between 4 and 7:30, my wife would not be happy if I was downstairs just dictating stuff. But I do it regularly to use the Mac dictation function to get some draft of what I want done. Although sometimes I type because I type about as fast as at least with what I call typing, as fast as I can talk. But okay, so look back at what you did, and I want you to see if you can pick out one storyline, one idea out of your thing that you could find useful and interesting. Now, I did this pretty short when we did this in my undergraduate class, and other times I've done this. I've let it go for like 4 or 5 minutes. If you go 4 or 5 minutes, for many of you, it's actually excruciating, so I've learned not to do that too much. But you might practice this exercise at home when you won't feel embarrassed that it's like wandering off the page. I've had students write on the desk, right? It's okay. But you'll find some ideas. So, if you found some interesting ideas and some interesting connections, one of the things to look for are connections that you made during this that might not at first be obvious. Something in your subconscious connected, so that you connected 2 things, right? Is that something that was obvious to you that they should be connected? Not at the time, right? And is it obvious, but looking back, like, oh, there is some interesting connection. Okay, part of what this is trying to get to is your subconscious. The way the human brain works, the conscious part for most people is a single stream of thought. And for most people, it's in words, right? So anyone here not think in words? Okay, so there's very few people who don't think in words. I don't. I do sometimes, but most of the time, I don't hear words when I read. I don't hear words when I think. In fact, for me to write, I often have to have music because otherwise I can't figure out what the words are. Right? So it's a little bit weird. But if you're connecting ideas, right, at your subconscious level, some part of you saw this connection, even if you didn't. And that's often where some really interesting insights come from. Raw conscious thinking, so subconscious is always running. The next word you're going to say wasn't really a conscious choice. They come from your subconscious. Something inside of your process is suggesting alternative words. Any of you ever think when you're thinking or writing, like instantly 5 different word choices show up in your head, or do you always just have one word? Two words? Right. So sometimes you're struggling, like which word? 2 different words are struggling to come out of you at the same time, right? Well, that's 2 different ideas, in this case just words, but at a deeper level from your research as you're writing, you want to be able to tap into that subconscious, because those subconscious connections are often a much greater source of creativity than just letting stuff flow. Letting stuff flow out of that are what you're looking for, not just words that are the obvious connection. And if you can find surprises, and I'll come back to surprises twice more during today's thing, right? So you want to find those surprises, because surprises are things that people will remember, right? So and if they can remember that part of it and connect to a story, even one surprise in a good paper, one surprise in your entire paper, it probably is going to increase the chance it'll be viewed as a good paper. If everything was obvious, then the reader will be like, well, that was all obvious. I mean, what did I read this for? I already knew all this, right? The reader has to learn something. And if they learn something that's surprising, it's even more interesting for them and more memorable. We'll come back to that. Okay. So at least for your first drafts, listen to your inner child. They tend to be more playful, creative, and full of ideas, which is exactly what you want in the first draft. So we're going to really try and do the same thing, but I want you to try and do your paper when your inner child's voice and tell a story. I don't want science. I want a story. Bobby wanted to do this, and his cat got stuck in the computer, and whatever, right? I want a sort of a story you would try to do as though you were, a little kid. And if you want, or to make it better, I want you to think in pictures and shapes and characters, story elements that like you would have in a little kid's book. Okay, so you can use your eyes this time, but let's go ahead. We'll do the same thing. Try and tell a story with your inner child's voice. If you want to do it with your eyes closed, it's fine. It's a good process, right? I regularly write papers with my eyes closed. Let's see. Okay, so that's 2 minutes worth of writing some of your story. So by trying to write it from a little kid's point of view, did anyone get anything they think is actually interesting you want to share? I won't make you share it, but you can do it in a child's voice if you want. Make it a little bit more fun.
I think for me, what I wrote was, say, go home and take a block control to and let it flow until it gets stuck on the side of the bank. The gas is will probably stuck somewhere about 50 feet away, plus minus 10 feet. What is the bigger picture of all this?
Okay, so is that story related to your research? Like this is a bottleneck for why computers get going. They start off really good, and then somewhere in the middle they get stuck someplace.
Honestly, I'm not thinking about it.
You just started writing. Okay.
Gibberish.
Just gibberish. Okay. So the goal was not quite to have it a complete gibberish story, but if you've been thinking about your problem, and you write even that, right? So he might not have thought of that way, right? But I saw it as a potential of a story where it's like something floating down the river getting stuck, right? But your interest is in computer architectures, ancient computer architectures, and like how to speed them up. Well, if you can find where things get stopped in the river, right? That might so. Your subconscious has all kinds of interesting ways of connecting these random things to what you do, right? And so taking a few odd side points like that can make it effective. Oddly enough, if you can figure a way to tell your story as though it's understandable to a 4th or 5th grader, but still has your core science, you have a great story, right? Because every reader will get it. It is not hard to write for the expert in your field. It is hard to write for the people who are not the experts in your field. And despite the fact you're submitting to a conference in your field, most of the reviewers will not be experts in your sub-area of the field. They'll be from the broader field, and so you still have to worry about getting them. Okay, so the next exercise, which is a slight variation of this, is now I want you to draw the comic book version of your research story. Okay, I want 4 or 5 cells, right? And they're just stick figures. Don't worry if you cannot draw. That is not the point. This is not about art. This is about, here is the content of a cell in a comic book. Does anyone know what I mean by comic books? Okay. So you're just going to write, 4 or 5 stick figures. Here, I'll go find a comic just to make sure, right? Because I think I have one in here that's. Come on, where are my comics? I always have some comics. Here we go. Right. So it's really just a couple of characters and a story that goes with them. Right? So this is, why do you write? Just something about your research. It may or may not. So your ideas may or may not work. You write them down. You look at them. It's like, yeah, that doesn't work. I'll try another. So, but I want you to think of the story of your paper or your research as a comic book. A couple of cells and some words to go with them. They don't have to be speaking characters. They can be other things, but the sort of graphical representation. Is that your drawing? So So I don't want your drawing to be a block diagram. I want it to be a comic book, characters, stick figures. So who are the people who care about your problem? There's lots of ways to get people involved in your story. Don't worry if it's not, if you're struggling with it. I got it. But let's have a good one. Bring it up, put it on the camera. Oh. Okay, so I wanted to get you going in this, right? So this is something that actually the ability to tell your story in pictures is very powerful. Right? If you can, so how many of you, when you were skimming papers, not browsing, skimming papers, looked at the captions and looked at the figures and paper and captions, right, to help understand the paper? Who didn't? Okay, we have some normal people. Okay, right. So the story of your story in pictures can actually be extremely compelling. We'll spend, on some of our papers, I'll say I spend more than 2 hours trying to figure out the story's picture story version, right, to make it for a paper. What's the teaser figure going to look like? What are the other figures? To make sure we're telling the story. It's an important part of writing, and oddly enough, I like to do that before we write the paper. Right? So there were 3 figures, I think, in the there might have been 5, but at one point in time I had to cut stuff out. So, right, I knew all 3 of the figures that I was going to put in that survey paper before I started writing. In fact, I think more in pictures than I do in words. So those were literally like the things floating around in my head when I woke up. It's like, oh, this followed by that will tell the story. That's not the way the story ended up. The last figure in the paper was the first one I thought of, and I worked my way through. But then I rearranged the story to make it more compelling. We'll come back to that. But so coming up with good pictures can help you focus your story. Oddly enough, if you can't think about how to draw it as part of the story, you might not really understand what it is yet. If you put a bunch of boxes together, as Zemran did, right? If you have a box diagram, right, that's not really compelling, right, to the reader. Yeah, there's a bunch of boxes, but that's just words like laid out on the page, right? Can I replace those with figures that actually capture the idea? So can I take what's going on and show some simplistic bit of data that makes it happen? Okay, and if you can figure out how to tell your story that way, then you really understand the story, and your audience will probably be able to follow it as well. I have been on review panels for proposals where this is equally important, and I can't remember who they quoted, but there was actually some famous scientist who said, if they can't draw it, I don't think they understand it. And this was, now we were reviewing proposals, and we had a 15-page NSF proposal with no figures. And there's like, I can't even read this, right? There's no figures, right? If they can't explain what they're trying to do in figures, they don't really understand what it is, because a figure is worth a lot. We'll come back to that. So let's talk about why you're writing. So at one level, you're writing to persuade people to get your way, okay? This is not like you're writing to become famous. Maybe you will, maybe you won't, but that's not what you're doing. You're writing to persuade people and get your way. This is true of all writing. But for you're writing an academic paper, what am I trying to persuade them to do? What way am I trying to get? Maybe. I mean, so it won't be bad if they conclude that, but that's not really what you're trying to persuade them to do. Understand your way of thinking. Definitely not. Okay? You're calling the reader to action, right? If you're not calling them to action, what are you trying to get in your paper, or if you're doing a proposal, right? What do you want to have happen to your paper? Okay, eventually that's the long-term goal for your paper, for them to build on it. What's your short-term goal? To read the paper. You want to get it accepted, right? Your first goal is you are literally writing to get them to accept your paper, okay? And there are times when that will change what you want to write, because for the long-term benefit of science, this might actually be important stuff, but it's really boring to read. If you include too much of that in the paper, you risk the fact it will not be accepted. Okay, many conferences, maybe most conferences now, have a section they call supplemental material. If you have some stuff that's important but boring, put it in the supplemental material. You want a proof? Now, there are some conferences for which your proof should be in the main paper. That's a theory conference. In any other conference, your proof should be in the supplemental material. It's really important. Somebody might care about it, but it's not important enough to use up your main space with, right? So you put the theorem in the paper and the proof in the appendix, right? You have tables with, 15 different experiments. You put the most insightful 1 or 2 in the paper and the other 13 in the supplement, right? Your goal is not to get everything. Your goal, you're trying to persuade this person to accept your paper for publication. Because if that doesn't happen, no one else will ever read it, right? So you really have that as your primary goal. You are writing for the reviewers first, for any paper you're going to do. In fact, then you can think about the long-term audience. And you can't forget about the long-term audience, because the long-term audience is something the reviewer might be thinking about. Even when I review papers, there are lots of times where it's like, I will never, ever use this, right? I don't care about this, but I can see how other people might. So if I can put myself as a reader in the other people's points of view, then maybe you can convince the reader to go for this. But you're trying to persuade them. Okay, so now we're going to take a step back, and this is a place where it really matters, right? What does it mean to persuade? Okay. And this is a trickier kind of persuasion, because this is not having a conversation with somebody to persuade them. This is zero-shot persuasion. You never get to interact with them. You send them this, and you've either persuaded them or not. So you have to do a bunch of things anticipating what their objections might be, what might motivate them, what are they doing, and you have to think about how that's going to matter. Okay? Now, statistically, you can also ask some questions, like how many reviewers have this attitude or that attitude? Okay? Looking at what happens in lots of conferences, as a program chair, as an area chair, as whatever, I can tell you the following is absolutely true. Organization is more important than grammar. Okay? Reviewers, there will be some, every now and then, maybe around 5% of reviewers who will crucify you because the paper's got grammatical issues. And they might say some things about it. But grammar is easily fixed. The organization and the story, if they don't buy it, it doesn't matter that the grammar is perfect, right? If it's not really relevant to what's going on. But grammatical errors are not good, but for the reader, they're not near as bad as these things. Things that are an illogical sequence of ideas, where you're reading this and you're like, why am I reading about all these details when I don't yet know the big picture? I will bet of the papers you scanned or read last week, right, there was at least one paper where you didn't know what the heck they were doing, and you were knee-deep into the stuff they were doing in detail, okay? That's a bad paper. Sometimes they'll still get through the review process because the details were actually important enough, and if they got lucky enough to get a reviewer who already understood the big picture, then they don't need the big picture to get into the details. But that's a lucky reviewer hope, right? It doesn't happen, so you don't want to go there. No real pattern of organization. In this section, is this section moving from the most important ideas to the least or not? If people can't figure out why things are showing up in this order, it's bad, right? So this is common in a survey paper when there's a survey paper that doesn't tell you up front, here's how I'm going to organize stuff, okay? And then there's just sort of like random bits of this paper, that paper, whatever. It doesn't make any sense. You've got to tell them the organization, do the organization, and then sometimes tell them you told them the organization so they can really get that out of it. But, and then finally, there's no flow of ideas. You know, where if you feel that you're starting over again with each new sentence or each new paragraph, it's like jumping. And you'll actually see that in reviews where people say, this paper was jumping all over the place. I couldn't follow it. It doesn't flow. Right? And sometimes that flow is rearranging. Sometimes the flow is actually figuring out what to remove from your paper because it doesn't work.
What happens if you submit a paper, you get really different reviews? Like here, no different. So had it happened.
Yeah.
What did you do? Which one did you follow?
So the real answer there is it's very subtle. So when you get very different reviews, you have to decide based on your experience and talk to your advisor, but looking at it, whose review do you think is the most influential? Okay, and I will tell you, in almost every situation, the most influential review is the most critical review. Okay, the people who were happy with the paper might not have noticed these fundamental flaws, right? Where if somebody says, you know, one of the reviews I was just handling, right, I was the strong reject, the two others were accepts. The paper has now been rejected, right? Because in my review, I pointed out logical flaws, right? The people say this is what they're doing, but this math says they can't do that, right? And it's their math, right? I asked them a question. So in many papers, you have this rebuttal process. You reviewers send you stuff, then the author responds, then you make final decisions, and that's what happened. I made comments, they responded, and then based on that, I said, well, they're saying that what they've claimed over here can't be true because they're doing it. And the other reviewers are like, yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way. We both agree the paper just doesn't make any sense. It can't be published as it is. They need to fix it. Doesn't mean the paper has no chance in the future, but self-contradictory statements are the death of a paper because now you don't know, right? And to be honest, right, one of the other reviewers, after saying this, is like, if we can't trust them with that, how much do we trust the other parts of the paper? Because if they're getting these things wrong, did they misrepresent other parts of what's going on? So once you lose credibility, that's pretty much done. And so that's what happens. Most of the time, the most negative reviews dominate, but sometimes that's not always the case. Sometimes the most negative review, like, this isn't new compared to that paper, as you've seen, right? And then you can argue, but that paper was published after I submitted. You can't hold that against me. And then sometimes the other reviewers will say, yes, you can't hold them against them and overrule them. And every now and then they'll say, you know, the most negative review, like, this is just irrelevant. And other people will say, no, I'm an expert in the field. It's relevant. I don't care that you don't think it's relevant. So it depends on what that negative review finds. If it has real flaws, listen to it. If it's...
something like persuasion is something where, like, one was saying you should write more on the state of the art, and the other one was saying you should write less on the state of the art.
Yeah.
So it's like, what do you do?
So that's a trickier one. They're directly contradictory, and neither one is actually pointing out a fundamental problem.
Exactly.
In which case, go with what you think. So, which reviewer's overall tone, and we're way off the normal track here, but from their tone, you can actually get a feeling, does this sound like somebody who's going to listen and actually respect what I say, or somebody who's already made up their mind? And you try and influence the person who you think you can influence. You are trying to persuade them. So if from what they said, it's already a no sale, then don't waste your time. Go for the people who might. And there's actually one other person in almost every one of these cases you're writing for, which is not the reviewers. So in almost every organization that's doing reviewing, there's generally a two-stage process. Not always. Sometimes it's literally the reviews are numbers. They go into a computer and they sort them, and that's the top list. But better conferences and most journals will have reviewers and an editor. Or in our field, it's reviewers and an area chair, or somebody, or a program committee member. So when you have conflicting reviews, those are the ones that those editors, area chairs, program committee members spend most of their time dealing with. Right? If everyone agrees the paper's an accept, clean, it's an accept, we're not going to overrule them. If everyone agrees it's a reject, we're not going to overrule them. In fact, we literally have rules now for our area chairs. If in our field, if they want to overrule the majority of the reviewers, they have to write like a 2-page response that has to be written and given to the program chair to discourage them from saying, yeah, I know more than the reviewers, I'm going to overrule them. Because that really annoys people. If you get a paper that's got 2 reviews, right? Now, that's different than the case I just mentioned where they started with 2 accepts and a reject, but then the reviewers were convinced by the arguments and they changed their reviews. Well, then the paper dies, right? And the area chairs will never do it. But so you could also be writing for the area chair, which is when you're trying to make that argument. It's like, you can't hold this paper against me. It was published after I submitted. That's just not fair, right? Area chairs can actually do that. And many of the conferences or journals have a way for you to send a message directly to the editor. And despite the fact that you might say, I don't want to pester the editor, I've been an editor now for 3 different journals. I would say a quarter of the papers that didn't come out instantly as an accept, which is very few. So I'd say like 10% of the papers get accepted when they're submitted with minor revisions. Next go for major revisions. I would say a quarter of those that didn't get accepted with minor revisions pestered me as an editor. I had some that were contacting me once a week for a month trying to get me to overturn stuff or to make changes, right? And in the beginning, the guys who were there for a month, that was too much. I got very annoyed with them and I didn't want to help them much anymore. But other times people would be pointing out really substantial things like this person as a reviewer was inconsistent. Well, if they're not consistent, then how can I figure out what to do? You can actually point out, I was like, I had 2 conflicting reviews. I chose this one. It makes it a little bit important. So jumping back to other topics, right? Jumpiness can be a problem. If your paper really is jumping from topic to topic, right? And these are signs that the person has written the paper without really thinking about all of the flow and all of the organization. Okay, so if you look at any particular venue, there is pretty much an accepted style and order to the organization. Most of them are going to follow, so they'll have section names: intro, related work, approach, method. We're going to go through some of those today. But I want to talk about them first from a structural point of view, not from a naming section point of view. So if I really want to talk about a good story, I like to think of this in terms of Oscar, right? And you get Oscars for the best picture, right? So this is a way for you to help remember it. So Oscars are the integral elements in an order for good science stories. There's some other orders that'll work for other things, but for science, it's pretty much the opening, which is a broad hook, setting the scientific stage, so setting the stage, the challenge, the problem that you're going to try and solve, the actions, the algorithms, the experiments, the approaches, and then finally the resolution, your conclusions. Okay, so those give you the opening, setting, challenge, action, and resolution, which stands for Oscar. You'll notice I've drawn this little diagram next to it, which, and maybe thinking of it as an Oscar might help you, because if you look at the statue, it's broad, goes in, comes back out. Okay, so the broad part of your paper, the opening of your paper, is extremely broad, right? Because you want the first thing people start reading to always include them. If you read a paragraph that doesn't seem like it includes your work, do you keep reading? No, you're done, right? So if that first paragraph isn't broad enough to include almost everybody who could possibly be interested in your stuff, they're done, right? So in that survey paper I wrote, that very first paragraph is like, the early days of AI and the big open problems of AI weren't solvable, right? That's pretty much to anyone in an AI conference, that includes them. Actually, it was slightly more tailored because the older people who are likely to be the senior reviewers for the senior track all remember the old days where lots of people built AI systems that simply did not work, right? I don't do AI. This is the first time I've submitted a paper to an AI conference since 1987, I think, when they sent back my paper saying, this is math, not AI. I said, okay, fine, that's not AI. I don't know what, I thought it was something else, but right, so you want that very, very broad opening to pull them into your paper. Then as you go through the paper, as you set the stage, setting the stage is really narrowing the problem. You invited everybody into the theater, but not everybody gets to be up on stage. You got to narrow it down to what you're actually going to address. Then you go through actually solving the paper, and when you get to the final, the resolution, you're going to tie back to that broad opening. You're going to get it back so that everybody reads the conclusion. Now, one of the reasons for that is, as was suggested, but many of you practiced, what order did you actually read the paper in, right? You looked at the abstract, maybe you looked at the conclusion, maybe you looked at the figures, right? You didn't actually read the middle of the paper until you decided it was relevant enough. So part of the reason for this funnel is to pull more people into your paper. And if they get interested and sucked in, then they will read through the pipeline in the middle. This ordering is what I like to suggest because it's more about how you look at the paper. In many papers, there's another model called I'm Rad, which is the order you will actually find in lots of papers. I for introduction, M for methods, R for results, A for either and or analysis, and then D for discussion. Especially social science papers, they don't have the same style, right? They'll actually name their sections this, and in some journals, they will name your sections this. I have no problem with naming your sections, right? So I called it opening, setting the stage, challenge, action, resolution, right? Opening and setting the stage could all happen in introduction, right? Or maybe methods is the setting the stage. I'm not saying where to put the elements of Oscar, how you break them up between the names of the section boundaries, but this naming is a pretty common thing. In CS, the more common section isn't to have a section called methods and results. We have a section called experiments. And we put the methods in there. Sometimes there's a section called approach, right? And then that really is the method section. So you can mix them up and balance them. But in whatever venue you're submitting to, don't deviate too much from the broad average of those papers, right? You can deviate a bit, but if they all have a section called related work, you should probably have a section called related work, right? If none of them have a section called related work, don't have a section called related work, right? So sometimes that related work stuff hides in the introduction. Sometimes it shows up in the discussion, which is much later. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So in terms of Oscar versus Amrad, right, really, I've sort of lined them up physically. You can sort of make them work out in all these different ways. So that's a little bit about structure. I'll actually go into more structure in the second talk, which I don't know if I'll get to today, given how slow I'm going. I feel like I'm talking fast, but it's going slow. So now I'm going to switch to the main part of today's talk, which I've hinted at a little bit, which is writing as storytelling. Okay, this is very non-traditional ways of looking at it in terms of science writing, but you'll see why it connects back. So if you actually look at storytelling, and I'm going to tell you a lot about storytelling in just a bit, there's actually what's called the storyteller's triangle. When you're looking at how to tell stories, you have to remember that you're mediating in this triangle between three people: the audience, the story, and you. You're the storyteller, you're doing stuff. There is the story itself. There's information that you're going to try and get across, and then there's the audience, how they react and do stuff. And when I view this from a science point of view, scientists are a little bit more sophisticated. We don't work with triangles. We use tetrahedron. And for us, there's one other element, which is the actual scientific truth, right? Underlying your paper is some absolute science. And as you're telling the story, you have to connect the scientific truth to the story you're telling so that the audience sees some of that happening. You can't just tell a story about ducks floating down a river, right? That just doesn't work for a scientific paper. But you can tell that story if you're relating it back to the random ergodic motion of code and how it, you can tell a story that connects in lots of ways. But you have to make that connection between your audience and what they're going to get. And if I'm writing that story for people for whom that's like something they're going to get, then it can be effective. The same exact story won't work for everybody. If I'm dealing with a group of people that view the world one way and a group of people that view it right, I could write the same story for an AI conference and for a vision conference and tell a very different story, even with the same science. In fact, it's not uncommon for people to publish the same core science twice in two different fields. But they're talking to two different audiences, and you've got to figure out the story that audience wants to hear. Okay? And you can...
So when you say the story, is it really that striking that powerful? Is it going to be all over the paper?
So the story is everywhere. It'll be more obvious in some places and connected weakly as you go through others. It's really hard to make a good science paper where the story is always evident. But it doesn't always have to be evident. In fact, in a good story, the reader disconnects from reality and is embedded in your story. And once you have that happening, the story can go all over the place. And they're not thinking about the story. They're embedded in the reality of that story. And if you can get the reader down that path, it doesn't matter that to you the story is no longer so evident. They've been sucked into your world, and they're going along for the ride, and then eventually they'll come back out, right? So this suspended disbelief, which is what you actually talk about in storytelling or movie script writing, whatever. The audience wants to become such a part of the story that they don't think of it as a story anymore. If they see it as a story, you failed, right? So you don't have to have it everywhere because you've sucked them into the point where they're just part of it. So now we got to look at this. Now I've told you that writing is two different things. It's persuasion and it's storytelling. Now that's weird. Most storytellers don't try and persuade you. They're trying to entertain you. Most salespeople are trying to persuade you, but they're not trying to teach you anything meaningful, right? So you're gonna have to balance this, right? So what do you think is making it persuasive? Why is it storytelling? What makes it persuasive and what makes it a good story? Well, I'm gonna first go through the elements of persuasion, then I'll come back and we'll talk about the elements of storytelling. And what you're gonna have to have is a good story that has both of these, because you want to have persuasion and story. So the first for persuasion, which is completely inconsistent with what lots of people tell you is good science writing, is you want something that is action-oriented with style and energy. You want to think about everything you say in terms of the impact it has on your reader, not on the information you're trying to convey. And as a dispassionate scientist, you think, no, my job is to convey information. No, your job is to get people impacted by this information. And so if you can present it in a way that gets them to buy into it and believe it, then you're having an impact. If you give them information and it gets thrown on the floor because it's like, this isn't interesting, you didn't have the impact you wanted. So you can't view it as just dispassionate, boring presentation of data. You want to give them something that really gets them to the point. So the next, and this is the one I by far struggle the most with, how sticky your story is actually in various actual studies, scientific studies, directly inversely correlated to your word count and positively correlated with the energy level of what you present. So short staccato sentences have more energy, right? Not long sentences. If your sentence is this long, it is hard to get energy out of it because it's a big long paragraph that is a sentence, right? I struggle with this one all the time. I write long, complex sentences that should have been broken up into 3 or 4. My word count is too high. My energy level, when I speak, is fine, but when I write, but in the first draft, and then you go back and you literally look at it, right? So if your tool will tell you that your sentences are too long, even Word will do this, and there's tools for just about everything. There's use LaTeX counters as well that will actually estimate your reading level, right? And oddly enough, if you're writing for a scientific paper, you want to aim for about 10th grade. Okay? Not 8th grade, but not college. Right? Because if you're college, you have long, complex sentences that only college people will comprehend. And when people are trying to review papers and they're trying to read your paper in 20 minutes, they really aren't looking for that level of grammar and complexity. They're looking for something that's easy for them to understand. They really want something that's a Harlequin romance, for science, or Sports Illustrated, or Popular Mechanic magazine. They want something light and easy because they're trying to review a bunch of papers. So you want to aim at that level that is lower than you might think. But you still have to come across as smart and having your science, but that's okay. But your sentence and grammar shouldn't be how you do that. Now, if you were writing for English literacy courses, that might be a different issue where they're actually grading you on your English and writing. But here, it's all about your story. So try and minimize your word count. Another good reason for figures, they reduce how many words you can have. And keep your sentences short and powerful. Continually think about it from a persuasion point of view about what's in it for them. If I'm trying to persuade somebody, they don't care what I want, right? They care what they want. So the way to persuade somebody is to speak to what they want and to convince them that what they want and what you want are actually aligned. They may not see it in the beginning. They may be thinking, no, you want to sell me a car, right? But if they're having a problem with transportation, selling a reliable car may actually be helping them, right? They want reliable transportation. They don't want that car, right? So if you listen to them, and this is much easier in a dialogue, right? But when writing a paper, you want to think about what's in it for them. Not our technique is so great. If you don't tell me what else, if you don't tell me as a reader how I might use your technique, I don't care, right? Yeah, it's great, nice math, right? Wonderful. But how am I going to use it? What's going to benefit me? How's it going to benefit society? What's in it for them? If you can say we're releasing our code, what's in it for them just went way up because they're like, oh, look, this could actually be helpful and they have code, right? That's answering a what's in it for them kind of question. Talking about why is it better than other things is good. Talking about how it could be used in these other problems is addressing what's in it for them. So don't focus on just the problem you solve. Somewhere in your introduction is probably the right place to do it. Why? Because you're trying to cast a very big funnel there. You want to talk about all these related problems that your technique might apply to. Okay? Classically, people do this in the last section called future work. I will try and convince you to not do it in that section, but we'll come back to that. So what's the benefits then? So talk about the benefits and then the features. So before you tell me how you made this battery last 5 times longer, tell me the benefits of having a battery that lasts 5 times longer, right? Not very deep for people, but the fact that it's more subtle, that tell me the benefits of an algorithm that optimizes charging is that my battery will last 5 times longer, and make that clear to the reader. We'll pull them into, now I need to know why that happens, why it compares to everything else, right? So tell me the benefits first, then talk about the features. And again, think about everything you write in terms of the impact it's going to have, not just information. You give information to help people make decisions, right? So there are different types of people in the world. So if they're an ISTJ, Myers-Briggs type, they like to draw their own conclusions based on data. But if they're an EN type, they're going to base it on intuition. But you don't know what your reader is. Are they, which of the 16 Myers-Briggs types are they? So you got to write for stuff that has a little bit for everybody, right? You can't just use emotion, but you can't just use data, right? So you have to balance both of those together in terms of their impact and put them together. Your candidates are, by the way, statistically slightly more likely to be introverted and driven by data in computer science fields, right? So if you have to err on the side of emotion versus data can actually help you have the impact. But I still recommend a little bit of emotional hook, because one of those reviewers, it's still likely to be there, right? The odds are something like 60% introverted versus 40% not introverted and data-driven. So it's not just it's the ISTJ part, the judgment parts. So you want to balance those out. It's slightly more than half, but not a tremendous amount. If you have features, and a big part of what you're trying to do is you're adding, so here's the benefit, here's the features, you've got to convince the reader that these features support actually getting that benefit. If you're going to tell me that it's going to make the battery last longer, you've got to show me something that convinces me that that's true, right? And then I'll believe you and I'll buy into the benefits. But without the benefits, I didn't really work it in again. Right? We actually like to think of this as a benefit sandwich. You want to start with the benefits, make the middle of the sandwich out of features, and then come back to benefits at the end so that they remember those benefits. Right? So if I think back to my big funnel, the benefits are for everybody. The middle is how the features and how we actually get credibility to show they're there, and then you're going to broaden it back out and hit the features, the benefits again, so that the benefits apply in other fields, even if you've not shown that. You can't claim that except in those two sections. So the next thing for persuasion is building on emotion and memory. So the first thing you want is what? What is that on the screen? It's a hook. Okay, so if you remember back to your middle school or high school writing, they tried to get you to write a hook. A hook is the line in writing that hooks the audience, right? Once they've gotten on this, they don't want to go away. So you want to start with that idea of a hook. Come on. And then you're going to build up on energy and emotion, and you're going to get to a call for action. The call for action in your paper is literally, you can't say, please accept my paper. Right? That is the call for action you want, but you don't really get to say that in the paper. Just like in lots of situations, if I tell somebody, I would like you to buy this right now, they will walk away. Right? So there's a part to selling where it's about showing them all the features, getting to the point of the benefits, and then letting them draw a conclusion. Right? So it's okay to let them draw a conclusion. If you've led them down the garden path far enough, there's not many conclusions left for them to draw. And then, but you can still have that literal call for it. So, this suggests, that our algorithm, advanced the state of the art. You've let them draw that conclusion. You didn't even ask them the question. The call to action was a statement of action that you have now achieved the state of the art. And in science papers, the best calls are the ones they don't see as a question. They see it as a statement that they're left to question in their mind and say, yes, I agree. That's the call you're trying to get to for many of your papers. And along the way, I strongly recommend you have lots of that in terms of the emotion and memory be through figures, right? Because they're worth a lot. One JPEG is worth 1024 words. Getting those memories, right? Now, how many of you looked at the survey paper? Right? Okay. Can any of you describe verbally a figure from that paper? No? So it depends on how fast you scan, right? But you're more likely to be able to remember a figure from the paper than the actual content of anything. Right? So, and there weren't very exciting figures. As I said, I was not really happy, but you know, I cranked out. We got it done. So good figures can be extremely memorable because one good figure can tell the entire story, or a sequence of them can. Those figures don't. They weren't really good, but they were still better than trying to explain in words what was the accept region and the reject region. There was one that was like a Y with colors and stuff in it, right? Right? In fact, I chose that one because it looks like the letter Y. Why am I doing this? But that's more so. Okay, so structure and scannable elements. Okay, 79% of the people don't read; they scan. Right? If you actually, we've had some things where we look at how long, and we've asked reviewers how long did they spend on each paper. Now we all believe they significantly inflate them, but the average reviewer for CVPR in 2011 spent less than an hour on every paper they were writing a review for. Okay. Now, how many of you could really read in depth and do a critical read in an hour? Right? A little bit, right? So you're at the border. That's what they're doing. But we also think they inflated it. Our guess was more like 20 minutes or 30 minutes for some of them. Depends on the paper. Right? But even if they're going to read the paper in depth, as you found, if you're trying to be efficient, you don't actually read the paper line by line, beginning to end. You actually read through the paper, then you reread bits and pieces of it, right? So you have to hook them with bullets, headings, bold, italics, okay? And when they're writing, those things are more important than just the first read, because when they go to write the review, they will sometimes forget, you know, believe me, after you've done like 6 of these in a day, it's like, what was in this paper? Oh yeah, there was this if I can find it scanning back through the paper, I'm more likely to talk about it in my review, because it was easy to find after I was done the paper to remember what was there, as opposed to trying to reread paragraphs to find the comments I wanted to make. They expect things to be in some place, section orders. They expect the first sentence of a paragraph to be key. So if you have something important, don't bury it in the middle, right? The most important sentence of a paragraph should be either the first or the last, and I strongly recommend it's the first. Okay, if that means you break stuff into paragraphs and you have paragraphs that are only 1 or 2 sentences long, that's okay. But every key thing should start a paragraph. Okay, paragraphs shouldn't start and then hide something in the middle. Or like, here's the most important stuff. If you find you're bolding a sentence in the middle, if it's a word or two, that's okay. But if you're trying to bold a whole sentence in the middle, rewrite the paragraph. And by the way, I'm guilty of this. I do it all the time. I forget, and then I go back and rework it. Images convey much more valid force than, as I've already said. Figures and captions, they get read 50%. So this is actually not science writing, but in actual studies of what people read, captions get read by 50% more people than the actual body of the paper or the magazine article they were looking at. And most people, in a short-term recall, remember the figures and captions, and they have much less idea what was going on inside the body, right? So, and for a reviewer, you're not actually looking at long-term recall. They read the paper, they write a review. They don't have to remember it a long time. They have to remember it long enough to write the review and move on. So you want that to be a positive experience for them. So we'll go ahead and take a break here. Be back by 6:05. I'm going to get you hungry. I think there's 3 sandwiches in today's lecture. Okay, so that's a non-trivial question. We'll talk about that.
I think I already told you, but just in case next week I won't be here because I'm in Barcelona for the Sales program. But I'll be back the week after.
Yep. Videos will be online.
Huh?
So videos will be online. So
Yeah, no, I'll probably download them somehow and put some on the plane. So.
on the plane. Yeah. So.
Right. Just like probably a suggestion. Like I have so many papers. So when you do like a survey, would you do just like for the recent ones? Like let's say like the last 3 years instead of going back to 10 years. Or...
So what you should do is you should try and figure out the story you want to tell with them, right? And that will help you choose which ones. Not all of them, right? So you might need some of the old ones, because if your story is about how things change, right? So I needed some old papers because I was talking about old AI versus new AI. So I had to cite some mixture. I was dominated by recent ones, but that doesn't mean there weren't some of the older ones. But even with that, there might be too many. In which case, you want to figure out the story. So if you're doing categorization, right? So one way of treating them is you make sure you talk about one paper in every category. And these other papers are similarly so-and-so, so-and-so, and so-and-so approach this problem this way.
Yeah, well, I'm working just like in one problem, which is the different macro for the underwater communications.
Okay.
And just like collects tons of them. Like everyone like has their own approach.
So my guess is there's some similarities among the approaches, right? So collect them based on those similarities. Approaches that used a error correcting Mac, that used forward error correction, that used so there's lots of put them in categories, and then you don't have to survey. So your survey might cite all of them, right? There's nothing wrong with a survey that cites 100 papers. That's perfectly fine. 150, right? But you don't really talk about all of them. But if you've told people, look, if you're interested in people that did forward error correction using BCH, here's the 7 papers, right? That might get those people excited. You talk about one, you talk about BCH, you talk about forward error correction, and then you have a bunch of papers that are in that category.
Yeah. And for the survey, we're not expecting to do like critical review. Critical review for each one, right?
No.
It shouldn't be.
No.
Yeah, that would take time.
No. So once you've figured out what is the story element I want to get out of this paper, you need to read the paper sufficient to validate that element is in the story, right? So let's say I'll just keep using the example, which I don't know if it's true or not, but of forward error correction with BCH, right? Well, you can't say the paper's in the category of forward error correction with BCH unless the paper is. But once you actually chose that as a category, you can literally do keyword searches among your library and say which papers use this. Then you got to read them to make sure that they didn't have a section that said so and so did this, right? You have to check that they did, but you're not reading them critically.
Okay.
So of the survey paper that I did, right, there were 40 some papers in there that I had never read. They're in my survey, and I analyzed each of them enough to say, yes, they're in this category, they're in that category. I put them where they belong, right?
Okay.
Even though I've read them in great detail. I will actually go back and read lots of them now, but because
Yeah, I need just to narrow it down because I'm having so many. Because I explored the one that's from my oral exam. Probably from 3 I got 4 now, and from the one that I searched probably will tend up to maybe 60 or 100.
So not all of them will always fit in the categories and always be relevant. So you don't have to. But I mean, our biggest survey, the biggest survey paper I've done recently, I think had like 168 references. So you're trying to write a good paper, right? Don't limit yourself. The number for this assignment was really to push people. It's like, here's a minimum bound. There's no maximum.
Yeah, I know.
So the topic I wanted to choose, there's already surveys done.
Yeah.
So I had to change direction pretty quickly. And now I'm going in a third different direction, which is possibly machine learning using with vulnerabilities. And what's interesting about that is that there was a study done on cybersecurity, like intrusion detection systems, malware analysis and control, but there wasn't one done on vulnerabilities, which I'm like, well, that's odd. So I'm wondering, am I searching wrong, or because there isn't one done, or is that potentially a gap, you think?
So it is potentially a gap, right? That's part of why you're doing this, right? You start identifying, oh, look, there's a gap, right? So it's harder to identify if you're not finding the gap because you're not using the right words.
Right.
So that's where it starts to become tricky, is you really got to dig into this. But another way is, let's imagine that there was a paper that did machine learning and vulnerabilities. What paper would they cite? Start thinking about that from a topic point of view. What's a paper they would cite? And then go find all the papers that cited that paper and start browsing them.
Okay.
Right? Because that'll give you a way of saying, oh, look, so if you cite them and then you can search, now you're doing keyword searches only among the subset of papers that cited that, because you can click the button that says cite, search within this, right, people. So then you can start searching for, STIG or vulnerability or whatever you're looking for as a word showing up only among the papers that cited that. Because if you search for that word everywhere, you might have found it, but it was on page 37 of Google and you gave up after 20, right? So you have to, it's both narrow and then expand your search in those ways.
Okay, that's good. Thank you.
Yep. Yes. So it's a little bit field specific, so it's very small subfields. 10 is actually maybe okay. Our department thing is about 20 but we're talking about faculty, so for students we're not pushing that. Whether you have an expertise grades of subfields where N might actually be that's complicated. We've got to be other world. There's only one conference on communication. It's got to know it's index of like 15. Yeah. Oh, so you also have to understand when they were published. If they were published in 2018, and H5 of 5 is amazing, right? It's like we published last month.
I had one in 2018 that had no citation on it. I still selected.
Yeah, no, they're fine.
But I'm in some of the other ones. I don't want to cite something.
The actual. So don't go for reputation, don't go by the paper, go by the venue resistance. So if that venue doesn't have a page index of 10 or above, then I would then the venue is probably good.
Yeah.
The paper itself can be nice. Even then, listen, one of my most highly cited papers is in a venue that has no resistance.
Yeah, that's what I meant. I read it all. Venues.
Right, yeah, thank you. But the real answer is, if it makes sense in your story, especially now, if you found it, you've done the analysis, what's the cost for you of improvement? Very few people will look and say, she wrote this paper and she said it was bad. Now, if you draw a bad conclusion from it, or worse yet, you believe their bad conclusion, then a reviewer might beat you up. So,
I guess I'm going to value damaging the reputation, but of my papers. I don't realize it's seen on paper.
this work, we also wrote it, has an attractive reputation. Now, open up the question to someone, but if you were to say, this paper is fundamental and groundbreaking, and no one's ever cited it, then you listen to it. So it depends on how you talk about it. But to be honest, unfortunately in this world, this is what we're affected by. Paper can have citations, you have more citations. For exactly the reason people don't cite them in the same way. That doesn't mean necessarily you don't have good things in it. Find one that's really good. Look, if you got 10 citations, see what other people said about it. If they all say good things, now if you actually 10 citations, all what you're saying, this paper is just garbage. You can jump on the pile and add to yours, like, and here's an example of why it's a bad way of approaching it. So it's not whether you say it, it's what you say about it, about how you work. Okay, we're going to get started again. Anyone remember what I was talking about? No. See, I failed. But, I was talking about, and I got the slides slightly out of order. So subheadings and bullets and things, right? You want your paper to visually be able to scan through, find the bullets and whatever you're going to have, right? You want those things to be clearly marked. If you have a proof in your paper, it should be marked proof. You have a theorem, it should be marked theorem. Proof should probably be in the appendix. But whatever you have in there, you want to make it really easy for the reader to find. And yes, it takes up space. And I will actually crank space and play some games to just stay within the rules but maximize space. But it's also about giving the reader some space as you're doing that. So you want to put all those things in there. I just put that slide back up there. But what I really wanted to talk about next is what are called sticky stories. We're going to start getting into the storytelling part in just a bit. So if you want to think about everything you say in terms of its impact on the reader, its impact on the story, and at some level, if you want to have good impact, you want to have stickiness. Okay? And what do we mean by sticky? So this comes from marketing ideas, but has now been adopted in multiple scientific places as part of what you want. So Made to Stick was a story, is a marketing, as I said, it's a book about marketing, but it's about why ideas survive and why others. And people in the study of science and papers, bibliometrics, and I can't remember the phrase they used to describe the science of science papers and citing them and who gets whatever, right, have shown that this actually applies within the science literature. So what do we mean by success? So success, as we had here right, in duct tape, is our acronym for sticky stories. So simple, unexpected, concrete, credible, emotional stories stick, which spells out success, right? So You want your story to have success. You want to plan for success. So you want to have a story that is simple. And I will come back to that multiple times today in our next class, right? A story should have one, at most two simple ideas that the reader can walk away with. If you're trying to sell them a Swiss Army knife, as your paper can do A and B and C and D and E, it can do all these things, don't. Sell them A or maybe A and B, save C, D, E, and F for another paper, right? Because they're simply not going to look at it. And you might think, this is a great package deal, right? You're going to get 8 things in this one paper. Right? You can't convince them about all 8. There are so few papers that have one good idea. 8 in one paper just isn't going to happen, right? So then you've lost the 4th one down here, which is credibility, right? Your paper in science, credibility is key. I'd actually start with credibility, but you can't spell success starting with a C, unless you're dyslexic, and then it's allowed. But, so the next thing is, it's really good for your story to have something unexpected. The twist, the plot twist that you weren't expecting is part of what makes regular stories sticky, right? Sometimes people go a little too far with this, but you'd be surprised. There are unexpected things in your paper. Now, I'm not suggesting the unexpected thing should be hidden somewhere in the paper and then all of a sudden, aha, see, it works, right? That's not the goal of unexpected. Unexpected is just that the reader didn't find this obvious. And part of that is your job of explaining it. I've read way too many papers where people go through the steps so simply, and I've written a few, that by the time the reader gets to the conclusion, it was obvious. Right? It's like watching the movie where you know what's going to happen next. Every step of the movie, it really isn't that exciting. Right? There was no interest in you because you were predicting everything was going to happen. It's like, yeah, but that was obvious, right? If you can make what was obvious to you not obvious to them when they start, and then make it become obvious as you tell them the story, that's a powerful way of getting to the unexpected. So sometimes it's actually how you open it to get them to think the opposite of what you want them to do, right? Isn't this really hard? People have been working on this for years. No one solved this, right? And then all of a sudden you present this obvious solution, they'll be like, well, why didn't anyone else think of that? On the other hand, if you start off with, like, here's this obvious way to solve the problem, and they say, yeah, that's obvious. What's novel? What's new, right? You didn't set them up, so you got to work how to build that up. Along the way, it needs to be concrete, right? You can talk about an abstract problem. So concrete depends on the field you're in, but concrete is something where you can talk about an actual problem. Right? Now, the problem in theoretical physics might seem completely non-concrete to us mere mortals, but to the people in theoretical physics, it's a concrete problem. One of the ways to make the problem concrete is you cite other people who have said, this is a big, important problem. Well, then it's a big, important problem. It's concrete, right? Or there's a real application that depends on it. Whatever. You want it to be concrete. The more tangible it is to people, the better it will be. Credible, I already mentioned. Emotional is a little bit weird. How could we have emotion in science? What do I mean by emotion from a scientific story point of view? You get excited, right? So people can be emotionally excited as a reader. Anything else that might be emotion? Okay, it's common for papers to talk about their applications. If the applications affect people, right, then that application might draw emotions out of the reader, right? Not because of what you're saying, but because they relate to the problem, right? So if you're talking about self-driving cars, and you're talking about the efficiency and being able to replace human drivers with self-driving cars, most people won't care, right? That's not really a problem that affects them. If you talk about improving the safety, where we can't have these self-driving cars hit people and killing little kids running out in front of them because they're not at a crosswalk, right? People might care, right? One of those stories is a little bit more emotional than the other, right? So you can play a little bit of emotional games in terms of how they go. Right? So, and then these stories stick. The idea of a sticky story is you remember it. If the story has a visually graphic in your head, not necessarily drawn, but a story that you can visualize the sequence of events of a kid stepping out between two cars, chasing a ball, and the autonomous car not stopping in time, right? It's a visual image that's hard to get out of your head. If that paper actually solves that problem somehow, it will stick with you because you will remember that visual image. Or, that's just one of anything you can do. But that's what you want, is something that's simple for them to remember, something that's got a little bit of surprise, something that is emotional, and for which you have some level of credibility. You get 2 or 3 of those, your story becomes stickier. If you get all 6 of them, you get the trifecta twice, and you make lots of money out of it. So, yes.
Point out the problem in the implementation, and then tell them we have a solution.
So a problem in your implementation.
And you have a solution.
Okay. So a problem in your implementation might just be you didn't code it very well. That's not a very, but if you talk about a problem the industry has, and it's a big enough problem, right? So but again, he's like, how slow the machine is to boot up. That's one of your problems, right? If you're telling the story of how every time you open up the computer, you're waiting, right, for 2 minutes while it's updating and whatever, right? People will experience that personally, right? That's a problem they will get at, right? That's a far more emotional problem, right? You need it now. You're opening it up and it's, you get the spinning peach ball of death or the, hourglass, whatever, right? Almost everybody has experienced that, right? So that's a problem, as opposed to, we've measured it. It's 30% slower than it should be, and we're going to fix that for you, right? That's not the same level. Okay, so coming back to writing is storytelling now, because I talked about, first we have to talk about persuasion. Now we're coming back to the story, because we're doing persuasive storytelling. So we have our standard triangle, but as I said, for us, we have to fold in the scientific truth. So we're talking about storytelling. It actually has 2 parts, the story and the telling. Okay, and we're going to come back to both of those, but first we're going to talk about the story. So what is the core of a story? What underlies the story? So this drawing is there to help you remember all of the 8 essential elements of your story. There is a character who is going to face problems and conflicts and have to overcome them to get through some risks and dangers to get to their goal. We'll get all these in a second. But this idea of this character has some properties, stick man trying to jump over a wall, get by the dragon to the pot of gold at the end, right? Those are classic story elements, right? We want to get through them. Well, you can't always get everything you want in your story. But if you work really hard at this, maybe you can get everything you need out of a story. And you might not think of these from a storytelling point of view, but we will show you how to get most or almost all of these in a good science story. So the 8 essential elements of a story from storytelling literature, the first 2 are characters and characters' traits. Right? So the character traits are what makes that character interesting. Most characters have some quirky nature, something about them that you as a person can relate to, or you can imagine some other person is and whatever. So characters want to be interesting. Characters have goals and they have a motive, which is not necessarily the same as their goal. What's motivating them to get to the goal is related. They face some level of conflicts and problems. As they try and overcome them, they have to deal with risks and dangers. And there's some level of struggles, and then there's a lot of details that go in your story. So this you could find in a English class. These are elements of storytelling. Okay? So just to make them clear, we're going to get to who is the main character. What traits make them interesting? So from a science story, who is the main character? The audience? It's possible the audience is a character, right? So if you're solving the audience's member's problem, they can be the main character, right? And the traits are what makes them have this problem, right? So that's a perfectly good story. In fact, it's a very connected story because the reader will connect with it, okay? So that's one good character. In fact, in my view, it's the best character is the audience or the reader, okay? What's another character? It's actually not always possible. You're doing some abstract stuff, it's really tough to get the audience member to be there. Your algorithm, right? So it's actually possible your algorithm or your system is the character, okay? We'll come back to that as we go through some of these other things. Okay, so those are the 2 biggest things I would see, right? It's either the reader or your algorithm that is the main character. Now there's a few other characters you can come up with, we'll come back to those, but we'll just go through with those 2. So the traits, what makes them interesting, whatever. What do the characters need to do or to get, right? Again, that's the goal. That part's pretty high level, and depending on if it's the audience or your algorithm, right? You can pretty clearly state, here's the goal of my algorithm. Why is that goal important? This is the motive. And this sometimes bridges the thing. So if it's the reader, they will have their own motivation. But you have to be careful. If it's motivating for some readers, others might not get it. So you can't take the motive for granted. You have to talk about why people care about this problem. Even if the reader already knows because they care, they might be one of the people that don't care. Right? And so you have to connect that to them. If you're talking about your algorithm, right, the goal is often, the goal is for the algorithm, but the motive is actually for the user. Right? We're going to improve the user's efficiency. We're going to improve the safety, whatever. Your algorithm is, as the main character, might still have a secondary character, because most good stories have secondary characters, that you're trying to relate them to, and your motives are to help them. Right? Okay? And that's another good way to get your motives in there are to talk about secondary characters and you can relate to them. Okay, what kind of conflicts and problems block the character? Right? Well, so for the real problems for the reader, that's generally whatever the real problem is. But for your algorithms, it might be that so far no one's been able to get a polynomial time algorithm to solve this problem, right? Or the algorithms take so long that no one can use them, or whatever the problem you're trying to overcome is. So that's a character, a conflict or a problem, right? Something you're going to do. Somehow you want to make them have risks and dangers, right? Now the risks might be, if we do this, the company won't make money. It's a risk. It's there, right? Could be the risks are if we don't do this, the system could fail or it could run over a little kid, whatever. You're going to figure out what those are. And then what the character does, the struggles they go through to reach the goals are a part of the story. And then finally, what sensory details will make the story seem real? That's the details we talked about. So this is, how do you make the story seem real, not just an academic piece? So that's how you take these 8 storytelling elements and put them back into the science stories. We'll come back to those again in just a little bit, but now I'm going to walk off and I'm going to turn this around. Instead of talking about stories about science, I'm going to talk a little bit about the science of stories, okay? And really, the science of stories for science, but we're going to start with just the science of stories in 3 parts. So the first is the science of story structures. So stories are so important to us because people learned to read, well, most people, some of us still don't, but about 200 years ago, right? The average population did not read before 200 years ago. And some people did. There's a little bit longer, right? So people learn logic and argumentative forms and how to formulate an argument and present it 3,000 years ago. It's been a long time. The Greeks were doing lots of this stuff, right? We actually learned to write, at least the most advanced individuals, 7,000 years ago. So, and by the way, we're using evolutionary theory, not biblical theories, right? We stop at 6 otherwise. But people have been using storytelling for 100,000 years, right? So now you might say, well, does that mean we can't learn and do new things? No, we can definitely learn and do things, but this 100,000 years of storytelling dominance in human interactions, it's not that we evolved to tell stories. Stories evolved so we could remember them and repeat them. And what works for good storytelling is about what works for people being able to remember and communicate without writing. We invented writing because we couldn't remember stuff all the time. We had more we wanted to communicate. But if you can make your story stick because we have, so the person who writes some of this, right, evolutionary rewired human brain to think in terms of specific stories, I'm not sure I believe that. It's correlated, right? The human brain's ability to remember stuff is correlated with what stories do. What causes what, that's a lot harder, right? Storytelling evolved to model what matches what humans can remember. So the human brain is presupposed to think in story terms. It's easier for us to understand stuff, to make sense, and to remember stuff if it's told in a storytelling point of view. So let's start with this short conversation. Where's John? Well, I didn't want to say anything, but I saw a green VW parked in front of Carol's. Okay, those are 2 sentences. Think about them a second. Okay. So how many of you thought when you were reading this that those are just 2 random sentences? They were not in any way connected. Right? Or did someone say that it makes absolutely no sense? Or did you somehow assume there's a connection, right? And as you assume there's a connection, you're imagining a story, right, that fills in all the missing information, right? So where's John? Well, I didn't want to say anything, but I saw a VW in park. So how many of you think John drives a green VW, right? Okay, that was never said, right? There's nothing in these 2 sentences that says John's driving a green VW, right? But, you know, in your mind, you're seeing this, like, not only is John there, right? But, like, he's hiding, he's doing something at Carol's he shouldn't be doing, right? Right? That's probably implicit what many of you saw in this, right? It's okay, Carol's gone home. There's a connection in the way we see stuff. We fill in information. And part of your job when you're writing is to make that connection vague enough that people can fill in the blanks because they actually feel good filling in the blanks. It connects them to the story, it draws them in. And at the same time, making sure they draw the right connection, right? Because you want them to draw that connection. So you got to figure out how to find that balance. So you really want to think about anticipating and the mind of the audience, right? So your audience has stuff, okay? One of the things, the most powerful things your audience has is a bank of knowledge, existing experience about a relevant topic or the narrative structure. Your audience knows something. And this is when we talk about writing for an audience. What you're really writing for is what is it the audience knows and expects, and how can I exploit that? And how can I take advantage of that? Right? So I was writing in the beginning of that survey paper for the older members of this, the senior members of the community, because the senior members are the ones who are going to review the other senior members, right? So they all remember the early days when we all thought it was going to be great. We had these assumptions that we could reason about things based on what we didn't see, as well as what we did see. And every one of those systems horribly broke as soon as you took it outside of the lab, because you know what? Random things show up in front of your cameras and random things that can occur in the world. So it didn't work. So you got to figure out what is the story elements that you know they're going to know. Prior information creates a context for new information. Everything you write is building on that context to add new information. So the more I can assume properly about what they know, the less I have to say and the more connected it can become and the richer the story I can tell. So the story structure makes new information relevant. So if I tell you something in the right context, you connect it and you see the connection and you instantly think you understand it, even when you don't. But it's okay. You don't have to get the reviewer to understand your work. You have to get the reviewer to think he or she understands the work, right? Whether they actually get it is a different question, and since you can't give them a quiz, you can't even evaluate whether or not they do. You're writing it so that they believe they understand what's going on, which is enough. Okay, so the magic ingredient here is the context, the part that surrounds determining the meetings and setting up the story so they're going to go down this place, right? And then second part of that is relevance, things that imply a close relationship or importance. And part of that relevance comes from when you said it. The things I said right before it are somehow more connected. John and the green VW in front of Carol's, those two sentences being juxtaposed right next to each other suggests a connection. And in fact, it suggested a causal connection to almost everybody in the room, even though we didn't say one, right? So you can exploit that kind of information as you're working on it, okay? So applying prior knowledge is also how we remember lots of things. So I'm going to show you on the next slide, and I'm going to show it to you pretty quick. I'm going to show you 10 groups of letters, 10 groups that have 25 letters in them, and in 10 seconds, I want you to try and memorize the groups of letters. I want you to memorize these 25 letters in order. Okay, ready, go. Okay, so how many people can remember those letters? Okay, so you saw it. Most of you can't. So Katrina, why do you think you can remember those letters? So if you can recall them, it depends on how you can organize that information, right? So different spacing will evoke different prior knowledge. By the way, are you slightly dyslexic? This problem turns out to be really good, really easy for dyslexics because spacing doesn't matter so much for us. We have this weird problem of that. So prior knowledge and spacing, in a sense, provide a context. So here are the same letters with just differences in spacing. Do you think you can remember them now? IBM, Apple, Microsoft, AT&T, and Twitter, right? It's exactly the same letters in exactly the same order. The only difference was spacing, okay? It's very powerful. As soon as you can chunk them into something you can remember, it's there, right? And now it'll be easy to remember. Before that, it was nearly impossible to remember 25 seemingly random letters in a row. So is that what you saw? Yeah, that's what it's so there's a lot of knowledge that allows you to put stuff together, and this is also a good indication of something else that's very important. The spacing of information changes the information. So how you present stuff can actually be very important as you're going to do it. We'll talk more about that weeks later when we get to graphics again. So now we're going to do something similar. This is prior knowledge. This is a little tougher for those for whom who are not Native Americans, but we'll still go through it. Consider the following sentences. John walked on the roof. Bill picked up the eggs. Pete hid the axe. Jim flew the kite. Frank built the boat. Harley flipped the electric switch. And Ted wrote the play. Okay? How many of those do you think you can remember? We just went through them all, right? Who did what? It's tough. Who built the boat? Who flew the kite? Okay? The sentences have no real context or relevance for you to be able to remember what's going on. But now, let's just change the names of the characters just a little bit and see how easy you think these would be to remember. Santa Claus walked on the roof. Easter Bunny picked up the eggs. George Washington hid the axe. Ben Franklin flew the kite. Noah built the boat. Tom Edison flipped the electric switch. And William Shakespeare wrote the play. Right? Many of you could easily remember these now, depending on your cultural heritage. So this is one where the audience's cultural background, you might be saying, who's Santa Claus? Right? Or who's Benjamin Franklin, right? But for people who've gone through the American culture, these are all very easy to remember, right? Literally, what names you use for examples can have a huge impact on your audience's ability to relate to and understand it, right? And some of them come with connotations, right? If Edison was part of your story somehow, he's viewed as this inventor, this really smart guy who's, whatever, right? Where if it was somebody else's name who was more affiliated with crime, right, might not have the same effect, right? So how you name things can also be very important. Okay, so prior knowledge and family stories, right? When you tell the stories to the family, if any of you have had stories telling with your family, right? You've heard them so many times. You have so much shared knowledge that if you tell a story and then you try and tell it to your spouse or a friend, it makes absolutely no sense. And they're like, what are you talking about? Right? Because they don't know all the family history. It's not funny. It doesn't have the context, right, of what goes on. So you have to remember that, right, it's what's going on. Well, that actually highlights one of the most important things. In your family, you tell those stories and everyone gets them. Okay? When you're telling your story, you don't know the reader's family. Okay? And you have another problem that goes along with it. And this is one of the problems associated with family stories, which is what we call the curse of knowledge. Once you know something, it is nearly impossible to remember what it's like to not know it, right? So once you've shown me something that's obvious, if you tell me that too early, I can't unsee it now, right? I can't go back to what it was like to not know it. And this, especially in the world of writing patents, but even so in papers, right, is really important. You got to write the story first so that the reader doesn't think they know it until you want them to know it, okay? But also, you've got to write it as though you didn't know it when you started writing it, right? So that can be really hard. This is another one I struggle with. Lots of science writers struggle with this. It's really hard to unremember or remember what it's like to not know that, right? I've been doing stuff in OpenSet. The paper I wrote was about OpenSet, right? Some of that stuff to me was so obvious that we've been doing it for years, right? One of my 3 most cited papers that I keep using an example that showed up in a really bad venue. We put it there because to us this stuff was so obvious, we couldn't send it to any conference. Because it was just like obvious to us. We've been doing stuff for so long, it was just, of course, I'd spent more than 10 years trying to solve a problem, right? And I knew all the flaws of all the other techniques. I never thought about publishing them. They were just like, these don't work, these don't work. We ended up publishing that paper and people were like, wow, that's actually true. They were amazed by it. It was like, we couldn't remember not seeing it was a problem, right? It was so obvious to us, right? But writing a story from a point of view that made it so it wasn't obvious when we started, but each of them got to see it all of a sudden, made it a very popular paper. It was very powerful. So you got to remember this, the curse of knowledge. You have got to try and write it from another point of view. This, when we talk about, by the way, having other readers, is one of the most valuable things you get from other people. Giving it to somebody who has not looked at this before, they will be able to tell you, I couldn't get from here to here. And if they can't get from here to here, you had a knowledge gap that said, well, I thought you could get from here to here. But that's only true if you actually understand how random orthogonal projection matrices work in Johnson's theorem. And people are like, Johnson's theorem? What's that? Right? I've never heard of that, right? So you got to be careful how you put it together. So you want to write from the audience's known banks of prior knowledge. Not from yours, not from the best scientists in the field, but from the average audience member. Okay? And realistically, if you're not sure what the average audience member thinks, assume they know almost nothing about your subfield. They know everything about other parts of the field or lots of things about other field, But if you've read 15 papers and they seem like they have nothing in common, then your audience might have nothing in common, right? They actually have some, but it's like they've all probably understood very basic data structures and but not a lot in common. If you can write it so that those people get it and it still fits in the right space, that's okay. Now, I do recommend that somewhere in your paper, you have 2 or 3 paragraphs, maybe half a page, that is written for the absolute expert. This is the best people in the field. These are the things you wish you knew when you were starting this problem, and like you think only a few other people in the world will know it. Why? Because you have to go back to that credibility thing. If you write the entire paper as though it's a textbook article, right, that's written for people who are just learning the field, the experts you'll lose some credibility with the real experts who will think, yeah, well, they didn't really push the state of the art. There wasn't anything really advanced, right? But if you have 1 page or half a page, right, that is super advanced, the people who don't really know what's going on, just skip it. How many of you read a paper and skipped over more than half a page saying, I don't understand this and I don't really care, right? Come on, right? You all do, right? So it's okay if you lose the reader for half a page or a page. In fact, it's really good if you actually tell them, I'm going to lose you. It's like, we're now going to go on to the more advanced reader, the more advanced material. You put that sentence at the beginning of a section, people just skip over it, right? That's fine. Okay, I'll come to it later. Except the people who really want to see the advanced stuff, then they'll read through it, right? So you don't even have to annoy them too much. So, okay, so facts can be relevant, can be made much more relevant by turning them into a story. One of Turner's is a guy about science writing, right? Science writers imply, or they bury most of their key story elements instead of making those explicit and turning into a story. Right? Analysis of how most science writers write, and it's changing, but it used to be, they always started with raw information, and they try to let the reader draw their own conclusion. The problem with that is most readers don't draw good conclusions, and they don't get there. So you want to lead the reader down the path. On the other hand, you don't want to tell them you're leading them down the path. If it's obvious, then they resist, and they question you. They think you're trying to manipulate them. So you have to tell a really good story to get them to go down the garden path without knowing that you're taking them down the garden path. So it's actually a tricky place to be. But now I'm going to skip the science piece, and we'll just come back to some basic stuff, and we'll play a little bit. So if I had the storyline, a mother pours milk into a glass. That's an unstated event. Sorry, that's an event, and it's not much of a story, right? It is a description of what happened. Mother pours milk into a glass. There's unstated goals, resolutions, obstacles. None of the 8 story elements are there, except for the fact that a description of a character and 1 event, okay? But if I can make things more explicit, mother's left side has been paralyzed by a crippling stroke. She fights to regain the use of her left arm. For the first time, she tries a complex action with her left hand. She is determined to pour the milk in to prove that she can, right? Now it's a story. It's got struggles, she's overcoming things, it's got all of the details, visual details, story elements that make this story more compelling. Now that's probably a little overboard, right? But if it was the same thing and she was doing this with, say, her robotic arm, right? The first one, right, mother was able to pour milk into a glass with her robotic arm, okay? But no compelling story. So it's probably a little overdone here, but I wanted to show these sort of extremes to sort of get you to that part. Okay, so now let's go through the story process. Okay, so you've got to balance merging the information context with an effective story structure. So the content, right, is the story, the scientific truths. Right? In our tetrahedron, we have the scientific truths, the audience, you, and the story. We're trying to figure out this process of what goes into that story. So you've got to figure out some way to merge the content with an effective story structure. So you want to find some way, the theme, the takeaway message you want your science to depart. Your scientific truths might have many ways of being interpreted in many things, but you get to choose just one, maybe 2, but really just choose one. If the the second one comes for free, you might take it with you, but choose one takeaway message. And this is by far the most important part of writing your paper. This is my message, because that's what's going to drive your story. And unfortunately, it might change. But you're going to start with one anyhow, right? Your story doesn't always go where you want it to. You start the story, it goes down the path, and sometimes the story takes you someplace else. I like to think of it as trying to find a core metaphor. So does anyone know what a metaphor is? Anyone? Sorry. That's a simile. It's the opposite. It's the opposite one, right? So a simile is saying, you know, well, actually, I have them a little bit. We'll go through more examples. But so you're going to search for that core metaphor. We'll come up with those. Given the metaphor that you're going to try and make in your story, you're going to find and develop your character. So as a metaphor, right, in the survey paper I just put out, right, there was a designed metaphor, which was part of what I came up with, right, which is this whole early AI's failed closed world problem and why that failed, to get them to see it's still a problem now. We've just changed the name. We used to call it closed world, then we moved to probabilistic. But in the probabilistic assumption, we're still making the same closed world assumption because of the way we do probabilities. That was part of the argument. Right? So there's a metaphor there that I thought many of them would get. Then you wanted to develop your story characters. Who are the stories? Who are the characters? Your algorithm, your theory, or whatever. Build your story elements around the character, and then adjust for the audience and media. So let's first talk about theme versus goal. Right? So your goal is for your character. It should be tangible. It should be define the story's ending, and it creates a purpose and meaning for the story. So in that survey paper, the goal was an algorithm that could reject things that were unknown. Right? There's a clear goal for it. Okay. The theme is for the reader. The theme is what allows to relate to the human condition. So the theme and the metaphor I was looking at was this whole closed world assumption that they've already failed in AI, and I wanted them to come back and be able to see that as a reoccurring problem, right? It's what I wanted them to think about, this whole problem of why it failed before and why it's going to fail again if we don't address it. And it lets them interpret what's going on in a very different frame. So even though I'm talking about algorithms and whatever as my main characters, because they see the impact it had on real world problems, hopefully they will relate to it. So the theme really is the core of your message. And the vehicle, the story is the message that effectively communicates it and hopefully helps it stick. Okay? And once you view it that way, the theme provides a context for them to interpret everything and to help remember it. So hopefully that will work for that paper. We'll see what happens in a couple of weeks or a month or two, whatever. Okay, so now I talked about these 8 essential elements. Okay, when we talk about a story, it doesn't actually have to be a lot of words. You can actually do an entire story in one sentence. So here's the one sentence version of the 8 essential elements, right? Blah, the character, needed something because some motive, but something was causing a problem, so we did this, finally resulting in a conclusion. Okay? You get, if you put in the characters with a little bit of description, you can get all 8 essential story elements in one sentence. It's not a problem in a paragraph or two to set up the entire story. And then the paper goes along, and it's now, the story's been set up, you understand the characters, and you don't have to come back to the question you're asking, right? Once they get the story, and it's in their head and the theme, they interpret everything from that story's point of view, right? If after I talked about Carol and the green W, right, the green W was in front of Nancy's house, right, the story continues, right? It just keeps going, right? Because there's 1 or 2 elements that you get to connect over time. That connection, without explicitly telling them, is exactly the way you want to get them to go down the garden path. If I keep telling them about the story and I try and make it too obvious, then they feel they're being manipulated and directed. You want to let them make the connections through implicit connections over time with just subtle hints, not making it too obvious, and then they will get the elements. Okay? But so these elements that come up in this first sentence, this could literally, now you're not probably to write the sentence that way, but think about that. In 1 or 2 sentences, you can convey very quickly the broad problem, the need, the struggles you have to overcome, and in the first paragraph of your introduction, this should be set. This is setting the stage, right? We talked about the opening, right? Well, if I go back to the entire Oscar thing, the opening is the character. Setting the stage is what's needed. The challenge is because, but there's a secondary challenge there. So the setting and the challenge is somewhere between this, but, so, action happens, finally we get a resolution. In that one sentence, we get Oscar, right? Now, realistically, when you're writing good stories, you think of this at almost a recursive level. Right? I have Oscar at a sentence or 2. I have Oscar in a paragraph. I have Oscar in a section. I have Oscar, right? The opening and closing, if you remember back to middle school, high school, right, when they taught you about writing, right, they actually talked about having a thesis sentence at the beginning of a paragraph, the paragraph, and then a summary, right? It's really the same kinds of things. At a paragraph section, many levels of the paper, you'll get repeating this. So when we put that together, you can also think of Oscar both for the organization of the paper, but also at a storytelling level, because you're getting some of the same things: the opening, the setting, the challenge, the action, the resolution. So you can even use Oscar if you're trying to remember what are the 8 elements. Well, Oscar's only got 5 of them, but a couple of them are related because the challenge has a couple of elements and the action can have a couple of elements, so you can put them all together. So you can be playing Oscar recursively at the paper level, the section level, the paragraph level. Generally, when you're playing at the paragraph level, the setting and the challenge are smaller because they've already been set up, so I don't need to keep repeating the setting and the challenge. But it might have action, some motivation, some resolution, action, right? At the sentence level, you can, but it's really unlikely to have lots of sentences in a row that are Oscar. More likely, you're going to have some variety of things that are opening for a sentence, an action and a resolution, or a resolution and action. You can vary them around to go for some variety in your writing. Okay, so once you have your story ideas, and now I want to come back, right? We start off with like this exercise where you're having your eyes closed, you're trying to think of some ideas. That is the kinds of stuff I like to think of as the inherent ideas. These are the things you didn't struggle to put together. They're ideas that just came to you, right? And those are often the most intuitive and things. Now I've got a bunch of random ideas. How do I put them together? Well, you can start trying to put them together by focusing on organizing those ideas to the reader, right? You've got the story elements. You can look at them and say, okay, here's how I put them together. Come on. Okay. So, anyone think they understand what this is? That's true. So what's the picture of? Coastline, yeah, you can see some water or a couple of rocks, right? So you have to learn to frame what's important about the scene or about the problem, right? So if I had started with, okay, here is me relaxing on the beach in Hawaii, although I'm not in the chair anymore, right? This becomes very easy to remember and put the context in, right? But from these little bits and pieces, it's hard, right? Framing what's important, right? To be honest, right? The chair, the grass, the water, the rocks, right? Those 4 elements are enough for Mark to at least eventually figure out what the entire scene is, right? So I have to balance. Do I tell him the scene or to tell him the pieces and let him make the connections? Those are different things you have to figure out to frame what's important, okay? If I had shown, however, lots of pictures of the light blue sky and skipped all of the water, it would have been really hard to figure out what was going on, right? So you got to figure out how to frame what's important and put that together. So part of the framing about what's important is the opening. So the opening of your paper, the introduction, the abstract, the two go together, okay, is critical to framing the paper. And in fact, the first sentence, and this is my recommendation, oddly enough, the first sentence is actually pretty audience specific. Because if people don't recognize this paper's for me, then they may not get it, okay? And it wants to be something that's a bit of a hook intellectually and emotionally for that audience. Now, when I say it's audience specific, it's not the micro audience of your work. It is the biggest audience that this reviewer would consider to be this conference, okay? It's not everybody. Because it's everybody, it's too broad for this conference or this journal. But it's like your best description of the entire audience of this conference, right? And you want to hook them all in. You want to get them sucked into that. So in the first 2 or 3 sentences, anyone who's reading these proceedings should say, I see some value in this paper. And if you haven't done that, work harder to make it that broad, okay? And if you spend lots of time on this, you can actually use the same elements, the same storyline elements in the intro, the abstract, and the conclusion. Now, you don't want to use exactly the same sentence, but the same structure of here's the audience, here's how I'm appealing to them and connecting. Now, sometimes, because the abstract and the intro are like right next to each other, you really feel bad about doing that, okay? So my recommendation is take the same idea and write it completely differently twice, but it's exactly the same idea in the abstract and the intro. If that's the right story to hook your audience, okay? And is it the right story? Well, part of that comes with experience, but part of it also comes by looking at other papers in that venue and looking at how they try to bring in an audience, okay? If you look at what papers from this venue were really highly cited and read those, you'll get a feeling for how those people in that venue are connecting to their audience and bringing them in, right? Sometimes it's like really great work, but sometimes it's like it's okay work, but it's just really well written, okay? And if you can figure that part out, how they did a good job writing, you can start trying to mimic that and sort of borrow some of the ideas from that. Okay, so setting the scene in science. We're now we're going Oscar, right? So we're back to Oscar. So we've now got the S. So the intro is definitely a bit of setting the scene for the science, right? What's most relevant in the existing science? You're starting to separate the problem in the intro. Here's what we're solving, and here's what we're not solving, right? That helps set up the scene, the context of what you're trying to do, okay? This is not a literature review. Many papers will also have a section called related work. Some will have it in the intro. If you don't have a section called related work, you need to have just enough related work. So you might cite 5 papers in the intro that are the most relevant to separate, we're like these people but do this part better, and we're not like these people because we don't do this, right? But you're not a full literature review, okay? It's just framing the problem so that the reader can figure out where you are. And so if I'm going to cite some papers, what kind of papers do you think I want to cite, and why? Well-known papers. Why well-known papers? Right. So we talked about trying to build on the knowledge base of the audience. So if you cite highly cited papers, it is far more likely the reviewers will know those papers, and they will get the connection you're trying to make quickly. If you take the most relevant paper, but it's obscure, the reader's not likely to know it, with one exception. If that obscure paper is from the same venue and that paper is recent, then that person might be a reviewer this year. And then they will know the paper really well. So you definitely want to cite them, whether or not they show up in the intro. But if they're really relevant, you might still have a sentence or two on the most relevant paper, even if it's obscure. But you want a couple of sentences connecting to the broadest, highly cited papers, because those are the ones everyone can connect to, or more people can connect to, so they provide the knowledge base. You're not citing them because they're highly cited papers and therefore should be cited. You're citing them because they're well-read papers that is more likely your audience will read or already know, so they can connect to you more quickly, right? And if you're like them, but you're advancing the state of the art beyond them, then you've really hooked your audience because more people will know what that is. Okay, and this is really about framing the problem. And I will tell you, you should not in any way disparage anybody in the intro. You may say you are better than them, but you should not be in your intro saying somebody's work doesn't work, it's problem, it's bad. So it may be true, but it generally doesn't hook your audience, right? Because they might like that work, right? So it's okay if you can do that problem better than them, but don't disparage people. You might do a little bit in the related work section, but definitely not in the intro. Now, did any of you read papers that had disparaging comments about other people, right? In the paper, right? They're definitely out there. I will also tell you something that has occurred many times in my experience, both as an author, but not as often, but definitely as a reviewer. The paper that shows up after review is not the paper I reviewed. Some of those critical comments might have been added in the camera-ready copy, where you literally go back and, well, you were told by the reviewers to make some changes. Some of those changes might be to be a little bit more critical, because now you're rewriting the paper for the final audience. And you might feel it's really important for them to know about these flaws. Okay? Now, the other time it's really worthwhile. So sometimes they show up even though the reviewer didn't see them. And other times, they're pointing out really fundamental problems. You know what? If everyone recognizes this is a fundamental problem, then it's okay to talk about it. But you can't break the news of this being a fundamental problem. It's really tough. I mean, you can get away with it every now and then, but most of the time, just be positive and talk about what you're really going to add to it. Okay, so now we come back to the challenge in Oscar. And the challenge in Oscar is the problems and conflicts and risks and dangers from the good storytelling point of view. So we're now relating the two of them, right? Okay, problems and conflicts, risks and dangers are always there. Right? There's no problem you're trying to write a paper about that doesn't have problems and conflicts, risks and dangers. Why? Because if there wasn't a problem, you wouldn't be solving it and trying to write a paper about it, right? There must be a problem. So it's all about how you get to present it. They drive all stories, right? So good storytelling always has some conflicts you have to overcome. That doesn't mean that stories are about failure. right? It doesn't have to be that the risks and dangers are so insurmountable that everything fails. In fact, very few papers that completely fail get accepted. So you have to overcome those dangers. And then it's how you choose to present them. You can downplay them and make them unimportant, or you can play them up and then overcome them. You can't overplay them. So if you play them up too much, you'll actually get things in your reviews that talk about you beating up a straw man, right? Which is a phrase that really means there really wasn't a problem. You set up this straw man to attack because anybody can beat a straw man, right? That's like jousting. That's what jousters would do. Like, there's a guy with a stick standing perfectly still. If you can't joust against him, you have no business on a horse. But straw men are setting up. So, but that doesn't mean you can't build up the straw man a little bit and then beat them, right? Just don't dwell too much if it's only a straw man. On the other hand, if your challenges and risks and dangers are more significant, the more they are, the risk you have, the greater the opportunity to overcome them, then it looks better. Okay, so view these as challenges along the road to success. You will get there. And what was success, by the way? Right, it's an acronym, simple. So it's what's going to make your story sticky, right? So does danger mean physical danger? Absolutely not. Very few of you are talking about, although I gave you the story of with autonomous cars and look like kids, that's a physical danger. Lots of the dangers, and I say the dangers in most science papers aren't physical danger, right? There's loss of money, loss of prestige, inefficiencies. There's some danger, right, that you want to play up that you're going to try and overcome. Any danger, emotional danger, mental danger, social danger, professional danger, or physical danger will do, right? Embarrassment, rejection, lack of knowledge, lack of information, ridicule, belittlement, right, being laughed at. All these things are anything that can drive a sense of danger that has to be overcome. That really makes it stronger. In science and engineering papers, the most common types of dangers are accuracy, speed, and cost. These get added to papers. It's best if you can actually relate those problems, right? So if I could improve, how many people here know Amdahl's law? Dang, no one teaches that anymore. Okay, Amdahl's law comes from parallel processing. Amdahl's law, right? So it's basically, it says how much speed up I can get if I have a system that has an elements of parallel and sequential, right? So if I take the parallel part and I assume I make it infinitely small, right? So I infinitely parallelize it, right? There's still a limit of how much I can speed up a problem. So if my problem has a minute of sequential, 10 minutes of parallel, and another minute of sequential, the shortest time I can make is 2 minutes, right? With infinite parallelism, which is only a 5x speed up, right? Or I guess if I didn't do the numbers right, but it could have been, right? It's 12, right? So 6x speed up, right? There's nothing I can do to the problem. But if I present it and I focus just on the 10 minutes, that is the parallel part, then I can get 100x speed up. But I can't do the whole problem. So you have to be very careful when you talk about accuracy, speed, and whatever, to make sure you framed the problem in the right way. Now, the right way doesn't mean always considering Amdahl's law and doing the whole end-to-end thing, right? It might be to get your paper accepted, you focus on this piece, right? You're telling a story. You want to have the 100x speed up, right? But reviewers might catch you and say, yeah, but you forget about the sequential parts, you can only get 6x, right? And then you're not as impressive. So balance what really you're trying to solve from the science point of view, go after the right part, but then also tell the story in terms of the danger, right, and where it's going. So resolution, the last part of the Oscar. This is in your paper, the sort of conclusions, discussions, right? So, in fact, we often call them just conclusions. Many of them aren't. We'll come back to that more next week, but or maybe on the next slide. So a good model for your conclusion section is to actually run Oscar in reverse. Tell me the resolution, then review the action and the science that helped resolve the opening. Because I started with some opening, and I want to get back to that opening. So if I start with, I'm going to get you here, and here's the supporting evidence that got me here, it makes a nice continuing story. Okay, so what about future work? I'm sure some of the papers you read had conclusions and future work. It's a common name for a section. Lots of people will do it. Every now and then, my students do it, and we allow them to continue. I view it's okay in a thesis because no one's going to read it anyhow. So, what difference does it make? And actually, the few people who will read the thesis are other students who are trying to figure out what problem will I do. Okay, so one problem with future works is very few people ever do any of them, right? So that's already a problem, right? It's like future work for others, right? That's really what it should be named, because you're not going to do this, right? You're done this paper, you're moving on to the next one, especially in the thesis. No one does the future work of their thesis section, right? They're going to a job and do something else. Chances are really small to do it. But that's not the biggest reason to not do it. The problem with putting the future work at the end is you really run the risk that the reviewers will look at this and say, yeah, if you'd done that, it would have been an interesting paper. But you didn't, right? You don't have to tell them all that. So when I said, I see lots of papers that change between the review and the final version. Future work is actually something that's added a lot that wasn't in the review section, right? One reason some conferences and journals allow you a little bit more space after the paper's accepted, like the review copy 6, you're allowed 7 because you got to work and stuff. But the other is because now it's safe. I can actually add it. And especially if I'm going to do it, and depending on how fast I'm doing my research, by the time this paper's accepted and we're turning in the final copy, we've already done the next work. So we're also sort of predicting to the world, here's the next work we're going to do. See, it'll show up in 6 months, right? We know what's going on. So in that case, it's not quite so bad. But otherwise, it ends sort of weak. Here's all this great stuff we did, and here's stuff we didn't get to yet. Sorry, we're not done. Right? That's not a very strong ending. It's sort of anticlimactic. If you're going to do it, I actually recommend you do it which for the other sandwich, the bad news sandwich. How do you hide bad news? You start off with good news, you put some bad news in the middle, then you end with good news, right? So that people are happy both when they start, they don't see it coming, and then they're happy at the end. So if you're going to do future work, do your conclusions in future work as some comments, future work, and then real conclusions. The conclusion should be positive in the sense you really did something. So you want to sort of have an attitude of, but yes, we're going to do this in the future, right? Not, yes, but we didn't get to this, right? There's two very different connotations as you go across those ways of presenting them. Okay, end strong. Okay, couple more comments on writing. Start early. Okay, so, and when I say start writing, I don't mean sentences and paragraphs. I mean the organization, the story ideas, putting the elements together. So you might not have recognized this, but what story element did I make you work on so far for your survey paper? Okay, so you're supposed to come up with your dimensions in which you're comparing stuff, right? In a sense, you're getting a way to have your, in this case, who's the character in a survey paper? It's sort of the topic, right? It's sort of like, it's this big thing, the space of problems addressed by these algorithms, right? And then different ways of looking at them. They're actually adding character details to that topic. This is one way of looking at the character. This is another way of looking at the character. This is another way of looking at the character. And by the way, I gave some of you comments. If you didn't understand my comments about like what I was saying, because I don't know how much you know, and I was writing them after today, they might make more sense than they did this morning if you try to read them. So understanding your story elements, right? You want to work on that before you've done too much writing, and definitely before you've done too much experiments. So why do I need the story before I do the experiments? Why do I want to know the story and the conclusion I want to reach before I get to the experiments? Right, so I can take the pure scientific method, right? The scientific method is hypothesis and test, right? So I need to know what the experiment's supposed to show. So if I know what I want the story to tell, I'm going to do that. Now, I will tell you, lots of times the story changes because the experiments don't support the story you wanted. Well, that's just natural. That's okay. You're allowed to change your story, but you want to start with one. You want to design experiments that support your story. So if I go back to my tetrahedron, the absolute scientific truths are not actually known. So not only is this problem, I got to tell a story to an audience about a truth I don't yet know, but I have to guess what direction the tetrahedron is pointing. Where is truth? And then I start telling the story from that point of view. And if it fails, this truth is over here, I turn my story a little bit so I can rearrange it and make the connections. But I'm trying to find out what that story is. But if I know what the story I want to reach is, the experiments are then going to be designed to help me to support the conclusions of that story. And if they don't, well, that's a different thing. But at least I designed them to do that. Okay. I recommend you edit often. Depending on your personality type, I can only write effectively in the morning. I can edit later in the day, but I don't write very well late in the day. The average number of typos increases very significantly. The sentence and things fall apart. Right? I can read and listen anytime, but actually doing this, after I get tired, it falls apart even faster. So you might be the opposite. You might be somebody who can only write at night. You got to figure out your personality for that. But separate writing and editing, and don't view it as write everything and then edit. Although I do that every now and then. You really want to write, edit, write, edit, write, edit, write, edit, and go back and forth between them. Review how the story works with experimental results. Right. So after you start getting the experimental results, before you write them up, sit down and have a conversation with somebody. This is why I like doing team writing, right? Sit down and have a conversation. Here's the data, and here's how it works with the story. And that might mean changing your story because the experiments tell you something else. The experiments might tell you what you thought it was, but after you seeing them, they give you a completely different way to think about how to tell the story, right? So the story was okay, the experiments are okay, but now there's a connection that makes it like, here's how I can visualize it, which is another way this changes. As you get the experimental data, you start thinking, how do I present this? And you might, not from the story point of view, not from the experiment point of view, but you start thinking about how do I present this, and that changes the way you want your story to go. Not because the core story didn't change, but because the context of what graphics can tell the audience changed as you change what your graphic looks like. And all of a sudden it draws in different interpretations. That changes the way you want to tell your story. Okay, edit some more, get some feedback, edit even more, keep going. So all of those are comments about writing. So your first draft for your survey is due next week. I'm not looking for sentences, paragraphs. I'm looking for the story elements, okay, and that you've done the review of the papers. Because it's really hard for a survey paper to tell the story until you've read enough papers to see that you can make the story work, okay? And that's the most, you don't have to read them critically. People were asking you, do I expect you to read these critically? In fact, if you do, you're doing it wrong, okay? You've read enough papers at a creative, critical read to have a potential story in your head. You've done enough research to know there are no survey papers doing exactly this in the last 2 or 3 years. Okay, it's okay if there's a dozen survey papers, if they're 8 years old, who cares, right? That's actually a sign. People like surveys in this field, and there hasn't been one in 4 or 5 years, right? Even if it's only 2 years old. If there are ones that are recent, you got to figure out how to spin differently from them to find your space, but that's okay. Once you figure out, that's what I'm looking for next week. And it doesn't mean you can't change it. It just means that's where you're at now. I want to see that the effort is going in, you've been thinking about it this way, okay? It's more important that you have those elements than you have all 60 papers, right? I wanted you to have 60 papers, but if you're at 52, I'm not going to count, right? Okay. Couple more. Some unavoidable sins in writing papers, right? The first is what I call grandmotherhood opening endings, right? So computer vision is an important field. I hate it when I read those sentences. Like, yes, I'm in this field. I already know that. You don't need to tell me that. When I said something that relates to the entire audience, right, I don't mean something that is, we call motherhood and apple pie or grandmotherhood, right? Everyone has a good grandmother, right? I mean, who's got a bad grandmother, right? So that's not going to tell us much of anything. So another bad one, which you'll still see lots of, is a table of context in paragraph form, okay? Which is, section 2 will tell me this, section 3 will tell me that, okay? That has no business being in a paper, right? Especially in a 6-page paper or an 8-page paper. Admittedly, if you get to a 200-page document, it should have a table of contents. But then it should be a document with like a table of contents, and you shouldn't stick it in a paragraph. So it's really hard to argue why you ever want a table of contents. But somehow it became a style for lots of people. Please don't. It just doesn't help. It's just filler. Yeah, it's filler. If you want to find filler, think of a new figure. You can replace that much useless text with that much useless figure. But at least it's interesting to look at. Conclusions that don't conclude. Okay, there are tons of papers whose conclusion section is a summary. In section 1 we did this, in section 2 we did that. It's like, that's not a conclusion. A conclusion is to draw an inference from the paper and state something. Okay? Now, you don't even have to have a section that's called conclusion. You can call it discussion, then you just have discussion over. You can have a section called summary, but I put that right up there with the table of contents. I've already read the paper. But with one caveat. Why might a summary be good? For the initial reviewer, right? Because they didn't actually read the paper yet, right? It's not quite the reviewer, sorry. It's not for the reviewer. But for the browser who's trying to decide, should I read this paper? Okay, my biggest problem with that is if they're browsing, they probably just read the abstract. So what's in the abstract that's not in the summary, right? Nothing, right? The abstract was a summary. So the final section should be a real conclusion or a discussion, right? And people struggle with both of those things because they're hard, okay? But that's why it's adding value to the paper and why you should really try and make one. And then finally, another common one is when the opening and the conclusion are a mismatch. The opening says we're going to do this, and the conclusion never mentions it, okay? Now, that's because one was written and 3 days later, the other one was written and no one went back and checked, right? You want to check that those two connect up. A couple of other things about writing that your English teacher told you not to do, that if you use Grammarly, this is by far one of my biggest annoyances with Grammarly. Grammarly, like a good English teacher, really wants you to have variety. They want you to spice up the words and not use the word deep in front of learning every time you use it. They want you to say broad, underground, right? It's like, what are you guys thinking about, right? I have no idea where they're getting the suggestions from, but actually, if you want people to remember things, repeat major ideas in several places in the documents. Don't think I can't say this because I said it in another section. Now, if you use exactly the same sentences, some reviewers will get annoyed. Some won't even notice. Most won't notice, actually. But you can take the same idea and say it 3 different ways, 3 different times. That increases the chance that 1, they'll see it, because they didn't actually read every line. 2, that they'll remember it because they actually got to hear it a couple of times. That'll make it sink in. And then finally, the chance that they'll actually understand it, because maybe in one of the sentences, one of the ways you phrased it, it's completely unintelligible to them. But intelligible to these other people, and then the second time, the first group loses and the second group gets it, right? Different contexts let different people understand things differently. So exploit that by using different contexts and organizations to present it in the same way. Okay, and actually repeat the same keywords. Do not listen to Grammarly when it tells you to vary it, right? If you use the word launch vehicle or rocket, consistently use it because it means the same thing every time, as opposed to, well, over here I had a launch vehicle and over here I had a rocket. Now the reader's thinking, are they different? Is the launch vehicle like supporting a rocket, right? In fact, you can imagine both of those scenarios, right? If they mean the same thing, use the same word. It's not what English teachers tell you to do, it's what patent lawyers will tell you. It should always be exactly the same phrase. Don't go for variety, but do keep it being repetitive, right? You may have read this paper 50 times or 100 times by the time it's done, and you think, man, that makes sense. So it's the same thing, right? How many times is the reviewer going to read it? Maybe a half. Okay, so don't worry so much about that. It's not nearly repetitive as you might think it is. But do avoid instant repetition, and especially tautologies, right? So if I said something, and then like intro to a section, I say something, and then I say exactly the same thing in the beginning of the next sentence, that's bad, right? You can remove any time your repetition is within one foveation. I can see them both at the same time without moving my head or moving my eyes. Get rid of them, okay? And then tautologies, things like basic, fundamental, final ending, true facts, mutual cooperation, right? Those are phrases that are just, unfortunately, some of them are common phrases. When Grammarly tells you to remove those as tautologies, yeah, listen to them about that. But not about the rest of your repetition. Okay, so we're writing a startup plan. You are starting to write your paper. I actually recommend you come up with a time management timeline. Here's what time I will spend on these over the next couple of days. You'll be surprised how quickly time catches up on you, and it's like, oh, it's due. I haven't actually spent some time on it. It is far better to get 1 hour of writing time separated as 20 minutes over 3 days, that you really think about your story, right, than to try and pack 1 hour into one day. What I did last week was really bad, right? I wrote a paper in a really short period of time. It's bad to do it that way. I didn't want to suggest that that's what you should be doing. Cramming is bad. But I also didn't care. If the paper doesn't get in, so what, right? So if I really wanted the paper to get in, I would have spent more time and done it with a better process. But this was more like, yeah, my funding agent said I should do this. I at least have to put in a credible effort. If it doesn't get in, well, so what? Don't think about this as writing. How many of you have ever experienced writer's block? Okay, a few. So don't think about it as writing. You can't have a writer's block if you're not writing. Okay, and I actually think about it as communication. And you're really trying to communicate ideas. If you really have writer's block, the exercise I gave you about doing it with your eyes closed, you'd be surprised how much they will actually help you with writer's block. But by far the best way to get out of writer's block, in my view, is to talk. Just turn on your phone, start recording yourself, and talk about the problem. Don't try and write anything coherent. Just talk about communication of the ideas. Here's the idea. Here's the problem. Here's what so-and-so said. You start putting those things down, then later on it's not writing, it's rearranging. Right? Rearranging blocks are much harder to have. Right? There's a bunch of words on the page. There's got to be some way to rearrange them, delete them, do something. Right? So just get a bunch of stuff on paper, then start worrying about putting it together. Trying to figure out the perfect opening sentences. The perfect opening sentence for your paper might be the last one you write. Even though I said it's really important, right? That doesn't mean because it's first and it's important, it's the first thing you should do. Because it's important, it's the last thing you should do. Because by then you've figured everything else out, and you can find the perfect opening to make the rest of it connect and make sense. Okay. Despite the fact that I said, don't write an outline for your paper, for many of you, it is a tried and true process. If you have used it a lot, don't give up on it yet. You can go ahead and make outlines, whatever. I don't recommend them, but if it has worked for you and it's working, go ahead and make outlines. However, if it's not working for you, don't feel you need to. Go ahead and abandon it because it's not really that helpful if it hasn't been working for you. Asking lots of questions. This is another good way of getting to where your paper wants to be. You don't have to have the answers if you figure out some good questions. What makes this paper different from that? Jot that note down, right? What makes this one different than that? What makes this one better? You do that a couple of times, then you can start going and you have a directed, these are questions I have to answer. Now I'll do a little research, right? You don't want to read all of those papers. You want to select items in the papers to fit your story. After you figure out what the story is, it's, does this paper belong in this category or that category? Answering that question in a read is much faster than reading the paper because you're really just trying to put in the various categories. Can I scan and find something cool in the paper that's really good? So brainstorming in terms of your outlining, trying to figure out what your story is. If you're really stuck with this, and I'm willing to meet with you, sometime later this week, we can talk about your story. But try some various actions to make this a little bit better. Try using only action verbs. No passive things, no background things. What I like to do every now and then is try to tell your story in words that rhyme. Okay, now this might seem really silly, but why would you want to do it? So adding a constraint to how you try and communicate turns out to actually improve people's creativity. So making things rhyme will make you think of words that connect to things in ways you don't normally do. But if rhyming's not your way, right, try alliteration. Make it all start with the same letter for a little while, right? See if you can connect them that way. If they make odd connections, that can help your creativity. You can use the very classic Post-it notes and cards. If you're not sure about, you take these little ideas you have, if you do that little blind writing on Post-it notes, and put them up on the wall and then try to rearrange them, and look at the story as you do it that way. Or in your buffer, in your Emacs or your text editor, just rearrange the paragraphs, right, so that they're easier to look at. As I mentioned, the free writing, which is what you did, or free talking dictation. Just talk to yourself and get going with this, right? Come up with a plan, come up with some timing to get stuff done, and hopefully by next week you will have the core of a good survey paper. Next week we'll talk about how to actually structure in writing the actual document level stuff. Today was just about the storytelling and connecting them. So we're a little bit over. Sorry for going on.